Chapter 1. The Morning Edition. Luna Lovegood turned the page of the Quibbler with the same serene deliberation she used for everything else, her pale eyes scanning the text as if she were reading about the weather rather than the systematic destruction of the most powerful wizard in Britain's reputation. Around her at the Ravenclaw table, the usual morning chatter continued unabated. Discussions of ancient runes, translations, and arithmancy proofs that would have seemed terribly important yesterday. She took a delicate sip of pumpkin juice and glanced up at the enchanted ceiling, noting how the October sky outside matched the stormy grey of the artificial one above. Fitting, really. Her father had warned her that truth had a way of changing everything, even the weather. "Luna, what on earth are you reading?" Padma Patil's voice carried that particular tone of exasperated affection that Luna had grown accustomed to over her 4 years at Hogwarts. "You're holding the Quibbler upside down again." "No," Luna said mildly, not looking up from the paper. "I'm holding it exactly as it should be held. The question is whether the rest of the world is prepared to see things the right way up." Padma reached across the table and plucked the magazine from Luna's hands, flipping it around with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this action dozens of times before. Her expression of fond irritation shifted to something else entirely as she read the headline that now faced her properly. "The Dumbledore Papers. How the Chief Warlock's noble intentions paved the road to broken families," she read aloud, her voice growing quieter with each word. "Luna, what is this?" The conversations around them began to falter as other students caught fragments of the headline. Luna retrieved her magazine with gentle but firm fingers, smoothing down a corner that had been creased in Padma's shock. "The truth," she said simply. "Daddy and I thought it was time." The Great Hall's morning rhythm had always followed a predictable pattern. The early risers would claim tables near the windows, spreading out their homework and morning post, while picking at toast and porridge. The later arrivals would stumble in with robes askew and hair uncombed, grabbing handfuls of bacon and rolls before rushing off to their first classes. Professors would drift between the tables, offering reminders about deadlines, and quietly monitoring the general chaos that was hundreds of teenagers attempting to become functional human beings before 8 o'clock in the morning. This morning was different. The change started slowly, the way most disasters did. A copy of the Quibbler appeared at the Hufflepuff table, passed along by someone's younger sister who subscribed to all the interesting magazines. Another materialized at Gryffindor, where the Weasley twins had received their usual delivery of periodicals that their mother would have confiscated if she'd known about them. Even Slytherin found themselves in possession of a copy, courtesy of a third year whose pure blood family maintained subscriptions to every wizarding publication, no matter how ridiculous, as a matter of political necessity. Harry Potter had been picking at his eggs and trying to ignore the weight of stares that had become his constant companion since his return to school, when Hermione dropped into the seat beside him with unusual force. "Harry," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been panic. "Have you seen this?" She thrust a copy of the Quibbler under his nose, and Harry found himself staring at his own photograph. Not the usual school photo that appeared in the Daily Prophet's more scandalous articles, but something older, a picture of him at age 11, small and thin, and wearing clothes that were clearly several sizes too large. The headline above the photo made his stomach drop somewhere near his shoes. "Boy Who Lived or Boy Who Was Failed, the hidden truth about Harry Potter's childhood and the man who put him there." "Where did you get this?" Harry's voice came out as a croak. "Everyone has it," Ron said, sliding onto the bench across from them. His face was pale, and he clutched his own copy of the magazine like it might bite him. "Look at the table of contents, Harry. Just look at it." Harry's eyes skimmed the page, taking in headlines that seemed designed to systematically dismantle everything he thought he knew about his life. The Dursley File: How Albus Dumbledore Ignored 11 Years of Child Abuse. Professor Snape Speaks: A Double Agent's Confession of Manipulation and Coercion. The Longbottom Cover-Up: How the Ministry and Hogwarts Failed the Wizarding War's Most Vulnerable Victims. "This can't be real," Harry whispered. But even as he said it, he was remembering things. The way Dumbledore's eyes had lost their twinkle when McGonagall had expressed concerns about leaving him with the Dursleys, the careful way the headmaster had always deflected questions about Harry's home life, the strange reluctance adults showed when he asked about his parents' deaths and the circumstances surrounding them. At the high table, the teacher's usual morning routine had ground to a halt entirely. Professor McGonagall sat frozen with a piece of toast halfway to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the copy of The Quibbler that Professor Flitwick had wordlessly placed beside her plate. Her face had gone the particular shade of white that usually preceded a truly spectacular display of Scottish temper. Professor Snape had acquired his own copy through means that no one questioned, and his reaction was perhaps the most alarming of all. Rather than his usual sneer of contempt for what he would normally dismiss as Lovegood's latest delusions, he had gone very still. His dark eyes moved across the pages with the methodical precision of someone reading his own obituary. "Severus," McGonagall's voice was barely audible, even in the growing quiet of the great hall. "Is this true?" Snape's voice carried across the space between them with cutting clarity. "Every bloody word of it." The admission hit the hall like a silencing charm. Students who had been whispering among themselves fell completely silent. Even the ghosts, who usually drifted through the morning meal with cheerful disregard for the living world's concerns, had stopped their eternal wanderings to hover uncertainly near their favorite house tables. At the center of it all, Dolores Umbridge sat with her hands folded and a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had not touched her copy of The Quibbler, had not needed to. The article's contents had been delivered to her office by Ministry Owl 3 hours before the magazine's official distribution, along with a note from Minister Fudge expressing his deep concern about the allegations and his complete confidence in her ability to handle the situation appropriately. She cleared her throat with that delicate little cough that made everyone's teeth ache. "Students," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness that had become as much a part of Hogwarts' morning routine as pumpkin juice and owl post. "I'm sure you're all quite curious about this morning's entertainment. I do hope you'll remember that not everything one reads in certain publications can be taken as fact." The comment had clearly been intended to discredit the article and restore order. Instead, it had the opposite effect entirely. "Are you saying Professor Snape is lying?" The question came from Susan Bones, whose quiet voice somehow carried across the entire hall, because he just confirmed it was true. Umbridge's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm simply suggesting, Miss Bones, that sensational claims require careful examination before we—" "Then examine them." Every head in the hall turned toward the speaker. Luna Lovegood had risen from her seat at the Ravenclaw table and was regarding Umbridge with the sort of placid attention she usually reserved for particularly interesting cloudscape formations. "I beg your pardon." Umbridge's voice had acquired a dangerous edge. "You said the claims require examination?" Luna repeated, as if the concept were perfectly reasonable. "So examine them. My father has copies of all the documents referenced in the article, the ministry records, the Hogwarts correspondence, the witness testimonies. Everything is properly sourced and verified." She paused, tilting her head slightly, as if considering something important. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer not to know the truth." The silence that followed was profound. It was the sort of silence that preceded earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, the moment when the natural world held its breath before everything changed forever. Then the owls began to arrive. They came in waves, streaming through the high windows of the great hall, in numbers that seemed to defy the physical space available. Tawny owls, barn owls, screech owls, even a few magnificent eagle owls that normally only appeared for the most urgent correspondence. Their wings created a thunderous rustle that drowned out the remaining whispered conversations, and their calls echoed off the stone walls in a cacophony of urgency. The owls descended on tables throughout the hall, but the heaviest concentration landed near the high table. Letters, both regular post and howlers, piled up in front of the teachers with alarming speed. Several of the red envelopes were already beginning to smoke ominously. At the exact center of the chaos, Albus Dumbledore sat with his own copy of the Quibbler spread before him. His half-moon spectacles reflected the morning light as he read, and for perhaps the first time in recent memory, his eyes held no trace of their characteristic twinkle. He read every word. When he finished, he folded the magazine carefully and placed it beside his untouched breakfast. Then he stood, and the simple act of his rising commanded attention more effectively than any sonorous charm. "Miss Lovegood," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall without any apparent effort. "Might I have a word with you in my office?" Luna met his gaze with that direct, unsettling stare that made most people profoundly uncomfortable. Dumbledore had never been most people, but even he seemed to find something challenging in her pale blue eyes. "Of course, Professor Dumbledore," she said politely. "Though I should mention that I've already said everything I have to say. It's all in the article." "I'm sure it is," Dumbledore replied quietly. "That's precisely what I'd like to discuss." As Luna gathered her things with unhurried precision, conversations began to resume throughout the hall. But they were different now, urgent and hushed, filled with questions that had never been asked before, and answers that no one was quite prepared to hear. The morning's normalcy had been shattered as thoroughly as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to the enchanted ceiling, and everyone understood that, by the time the sun set again, nothing at Hogwarts would ever be quite the same. At the Ravenclaw table, Padma Patil stared at the spot where Luna had been sitting, then looked down at her own copy of the Quibbler. The magazine seemed heavier now, weighted with implications that stretched far beyond the simple pleasure of reading about crumple-horned snorkacs and conspiracy theories. Did she really just challenge Dumbledore? She whispered to no one in particular. "No," said Cho Chang, who had been following the exchange with the sort of fascinated horror usually reserved for particularly spectacular Quidditch crashes. She challenged everyone. And indeed, as Luna Lovegood walked calmly out of the great hall with the eyes of the entire school upon her, it was clear that the quiet Ravenclaw had done something far more dangerous than simply publishing an article. She had told the truth. Chapter 2. Letters of Summons. The Morning Post usually arrived at Augusta Longbottom's estate with the punctuality of clockwork and the discretion of a well-trained house elf. 3 owls, no more and no less, would perch on the stone balustrade of her breakfast terrace, one carrying the Daily Prophet, another with her personal correspondence, and a third bearing whatever magazines or periodicals her late husband had subscribed to decades ago, and which she had never bothered to cancel. This morning, her usual barn owl was accompanied by an unfamiliar tawny that clutched a rolled copy of the Quibbler in its talons with unusual insistence. Augusta had always maintained that Xenophilius Lovegood's publication was 90% nonsense and 10% accidentally prescient, which made it marginally more reliable than the Daily Prophet on its worst days. She unrolled the magazine with the resigned efficiency of someone accustomed to disappointing reading material, expecting the usual fare of fantastic creatures and conspiracy theories. The photograph on the front page made her teacup rattle against its saucer, as her hands began to tremble with something that was decidedly not age-related weakness. It was Frank. Her Frank, as he had looked at 19, standing proud in his aura robes beside his new wife Alice. But the headline above the photograph spoke of failures and cover-ups, of young people sacrificed to older men's strategies, of families left to suffer in silence while the wizarding world celebrated its supposed saviors. Augusta read the article 3 times. By the third reading, her hands had stopped trembling entirely, replaced by the sort of stillness that preceded explosive action. "Tibby!" she called, her voice carrying the particular tone that sent her house elf scrambling. "Yes, Mistress Augusta?" "Prepare the carriage, the good one, with the family crest clearly visible, and send word to young Neville that his grandmother will be visiting his school today." She folded the magazine carefully, as if it were evidence in a trial, which, she supposed, it was. "It seems there are some overdue conversations to be had." Tibby's ears drooped with concern. "Will you be wanting the formal robes, mistress?" Augusta's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh yes, Tibby, the formal robes, and the long-bottom family ring. I want there to be absolutely no question about who is calling Albus Dumbledore to account." Across London, in a narrow house tucked between a bakery and a second-hand bookshop, Andromeda Tonks was dealing with her own reaction to the morning's revelations. Unlike Augusta's explosive fury, Andromeda's response was the cold, controlled anger that came from a lifetime of disappointment in the wizarding world's capacity for justice. She had been disowned by her family for marrying a Muggle-born. She had lost her husband to Voldemort's followers. She was raising her daughter alone while watching her cousin Sirius struggle to reclaim a life stolen from him by 12 years of wrongful imprisonment. And now she was reading about how Albus Dumbledore, the man everyone praised as the champion of the light, had known all along that Sirius was innocent and had done nothing to secure his freedom. "Mummy?" Nymphadora appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair an unconscious shade of angry red that matched her mother's emotional state. "You look like you're planning someone's funeral." "Not planning," Andromeda replied quietly, still reading. "Attending. Get your travelling cloak, dear. We're going to Hogwarts." "What? Why? Is Harry all right?" Andromeda handed her daughter the magazine without a word. Tonks read it with growing horror, her hair cycling through increasingly alarming shades of crimson and black. "Bloody hell," she breathed. Sirius is going to stay exactly where he is until this is resolved," Andromeda said firmly. "He's too emotionally involved to handle this properly, and the last thing any of us need is for him to do something spectacularly reckless that ruins whatever chance we have of getting real answers." She stood and smoothed down her robes with movements that spoke of barely controlled energy. "No, this requires a different approach. The Black family may have disowned me, but I am still a Black, and Blacks do not allow their blood to be treated as expendable by anyone, no matter how many titles they hold or how many wars they've won." Tonks stared at her mother with something approaching awe. "You're going to tear Dumbledore apart." "I'm going to ask him some very pointed questions in front of witnesses," Andromeda corrected. "The tearing apart will depend entirely on his answers." In the comfortable sitting room of what had once been the Bones family's ancestral home, Amelia's surviving relatives gathered around a copy of the Quibbler that had arrived by emergency owl from a family friend at the ministry. The article's section on "The Disappeared and the Forgotten," how wartime casualties were written off as acceptable losses, featured a photograph of Edgar Bones and his wife, along with a detailed account of how their deaths had been deemed strategically necessary in documents that should never have seen the light of day. Eleanor Bones, Edgar's surviving sister, set down the magazine with hands that shook with grief and fury. "He knew," she whispered. "Dumbledore knew Edgar was walking into a trap, and he let it happen because it would maintain Snape's cover and serve the greater good." Her daughter Susan was home for the weekend, and she had gone very pale as she read over her aunt's shoulder. "Aunt Eleanor, this can't be right. Professor Dumbledore would never—" "Professor Dumbledore," Eleanor said with bitter precision, "has been making decisions about who lives and dies for longer than you've been alive, dear one, and apparently he decided our family was expendable." She rose from her chair with purpose. "Pack a bag, Susan. We're going back to your school early. It's time the wizarding world learned exactly what their precious leader's greater good has cost the rest of us." The reactions were not limited to families with obvious grievances. Throughout Wizarding Britain, copies of the Quibbler found their way into households that had previously dismissed Xenophilius Lovegood's publication as harmless eccentricity. At Malfoy Manor, Narcissa Malfoy read the article with growing interest, noting particularly the sections that detailed Dumbledore's manipulation of Severus Snape and his apparent willingness to sacrifice anyone who served his purposes. Lucius was still imprisoned in Azkaban, but Narcissa had not survived this long in the treacherous waters of pure-blood politics without learning to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. "Dobby!" she called, though the house elf was no longer bound to their family. Instead, it was their remaining elf, Creature's replacement, who appeared. "Yes, mistress." "Send word to the other prominent families, the Greengrasses, the Parkinsons, the Zabinis. Tell them that Narcissa Malfoy believes it may be time for a unified response to recent revelations about Hogwarts' leadership." She smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. After all, we cannot allow our children to remain in an institution where the headmaster has proven himself so morally flexible. The political implications were not lost on any of the recipients of these messages. If Dumbledore could be removed or significantly weakened, it would shift the balance of power in the wizarding world considerably. And if that happened to align with their own desires for revenge against the man who had helped bring down their associates in the last war, well, sometimes personal satisfaction and political advantage walked hand in hand. But perhaps the most complex reaction came from a small cottage near Ottery Street, Catchpole, where distant members of the Prewett family had received their copy of the Quibbler through a network of family connections that stretched back generations. Ignatius Prewett, great-uncle to the late Fabian and Gideon, read the article's account of how his great-nephews had been sent on a mission that Dumbledore's own strategic notes described as likely to result in casualties, but necessary to maintain the impression of active resistance. The old man had fought in Grindelwald's war, had lost friends and family to conflicts that seemed to repeat themselves every generation, and he had thought he was beyond being shocked by the cost of fighting dark wizards. He had been wrong. "Enid!" he called to his wife, who was tending her garden with the determined cheerfulness of someone trying to create beauty in a world determined to destroy it. "We need to talk to Molly." "About what, dear?" "About whether she knows how her brothers really died." The conversation that followed was difficult and painful, conducted through Flu Network with a Molly Weasley who had initially been defensive about any criticism of Dumbledore, but who grew quieter and more troubled as the details were shared. By the end of it, she was crying. Not the dramatic tears of immediate grief, but the slow, steady weeping of someone discovering that a wound they thought had healed had been infected all along. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Arthur and we trusted him completely. If he really—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implications hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Meanwhile, at the offices of the Quibbler, Xenophilius Lovegood was experiencing the most eventful morning of his professional career. Owls had been arriving steadily since dawn, carrying letters that ranged from enthusiastic support to death threats, with very little middle ground between the two extremes. He opened each letter methodically, sorting them into piles with the same careful attention he gave to reports of crumple-horned Snorkak sightings. The death threats went into one pile. They were surprisingly well written, actually, with several showing genuine literary merit. The expressions of support went into another, many of them from families who had suffered losses during the war and had never been given satisfactory explanations. But it was the third pile that interested him most. Letters from ministry officials, former Aurors, and other members of the wizarding establishment, offering to provide additional documentation and testimony to support his article's claims. Apparently, he and Luna had opened a floodgate that had been straining against its constraints for years. He was examining a particularly interesting letter from a retired Auror who claimed to have copies of Dumbledore's strategic correspondence when his flu network activated with a roar of green flames. "Xenophilius Lovegood, you magnificent bastard!" The voice belonged to Mundungus Fletcher, who tumbled out of the fireplace with his usual lack of grace, but an unusual amount of enthusiasm. "Mundungus," Xenophilius greeted him mildly. "I take it you've read today's edition?" "Read it. I've memorized it. Do you have any idea how long some of us have been waiting for someone to say these things publicly?" Mundungus grinned, showing several missing teeth. "I've got information you'll want. Names, dates, places. Things that'll make your article look like a gentle critique." Xenophilius regarded the disreputable wizard thoughtfully. "What sort of information?" "The kind that shows exactly how many people Dumbledore's been manipulating over the years. The kind that proves he's been playing everyone, light, dark, and neutral, like pieces on a chessboard." Mundungus's expression grew serious, which was deeply unsettling on his normally jovial face. "The kind that'll bring his whole bloody house of cards crashing down." As morning progressed toward afternoon, a curious thing began to happen. Carriages, both magical and mundane, started appearing on the roads leading to Hogwarts. Not the usual traffic of students returning from weekends at home, but formal processions bearing family crests and travelling with the sort of purpose that suggested urgent business. By noon, Augusta Longbottom's carriage was leading a small convoy of vehicles carrying representatives from nearly a dozen prominent wizarding families, all united by a shared desire for answers and a growing certainty that those answers had been deliberately withheld for far too long. At Hogwarts itself, Professor McGonagall stood at her office window, watching the approaching carriages with growing alarm. "Albus," she said without turning around, "I believe we're about to have company." From behind her, Dumbledore's voice carried a weariness that she had never heard before. "Yes, Minerva. I rather suspected we would." "Are you prepared to answer their questions?" There was a long pause before he replied. "I'm prepared to try." McGonagall finally turned to face him, and what she saw in his expression made her understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly how heavy the burden of leadership had become for the man she had followed without question for decades. "Albus," she said quietly, "what have we done?" His smile, when it came, held no trace of his usual humour. "What we thought was necessary, Minerva. The question now is whether that will be enough to justify the cost." Outside, the first carriages were passing through Hogwarts gates, and McGonagall could see the determined faces of people who had travelled a long way to demand answers that should have been given years ago. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Harry Potter had always prided himself on his ability to handle shocking revelations. After 4 years at Hogwarts, he had developed what he considered a reasonable tolerance for having his worldview systematically demolished on a regular basis. He had learned that his parents were murdered, that he was famous for something he couldn't remember, that one of his professors had been possessed by Voldemort, that his godfather was innocent of terrible crimes, and that the Dark Lord had returned to terrorize the wizarding world. None of it had prepared him for reading about his own childhood, described in clinical detail as a case study in systematic negligence. He sat in the Gryffindor common room, staring at the copy of the Quibbler that Hermione had pressed into his hands hours ago, reading the same paragraph for what felt like the 100th time. The words seemed to rearrange themselves each time he looked at them, but their meaning remained stubbornly, devastatingly clear. Subject was placed with relatives, despite documented history of animosity toward magical community. He read aloud to the empty room, his voice barely above a whisper. Monitoring protocols were minimal to non-existent. Physical signs of malnutrition and possible abuse were noted during initial Hogwarts assessment, but not investigated further. The common room fire crackled cheerfully, oblivious to the fact that Harry's entire understanding of his life was crumbling like poorly mixed concrete. "Harry?" He looked up to find Ginny Weasley standing in the doorway, her face creased with concern. She had been one of the few people to treat him normally since his return to school, neither fawning over him as the boy who lived, nor avoiding him as the boy who might be mad. Now she looked at him as if he might shatter if she spoke too loudly. "Are you all right?" she asked, settling into the armchair across from him. Harry laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. No, I don't think I'm all right. I think I might be the opposite of all right. The article is true." The words fell from his mouth like stones into a still pond, creating ripples that would reach every corner of his existence. Every bloody word of it. Dumbledore knew what they were like. He knew, and he left me there anyway. Ginny's face went very pale. "Harry, you don't know that. The Quibbler isn't always accurate. Luna's father has documentation, Ginny. Copies of reports, correspondence, witness statements. Professor Snape confirmed it himself in the Great Hall." Harry set down the magazine and rubbed his eyes, suddenly feeling far older than his 15 years. "Dumbledore has been making decisions about my life since before I could walk, and apparently my happiness was never part of the equation." The portrait hole swung open with more force than necessary, and Ron stumbled through, his face flushed and his robes disheveled. "Have you seen what's happening outside?" he demanded without preamble. "There are carriages coming up the drive, proper ones, with family crests and everything. Mum sent an owl saying, 'Neville's gran is on her way here with half the bloody wizarding establishment.'" Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ron said, dropping into a chair and running his hands through his hair, "that every family Dumbledore apparently screwed over is coming here. Today. Mum said something about the Prewetts and Uncle Fabian and Uncle Gideon, but she was crying and not making much sense." Ginny went even paler, if that was possible. "The Prewetts? But they're dead, yeah. Killed in the First War." Ron's voice was tight with something that might have been fear or anger or both. "But apparently there's more to the story than we were told. Isn't there always?" Meanwhile, 3 floors above the Gryffindor common room, Hermione Granger was discovering that knowledge could be a weapon turned against itself. She had spent the afternoon in the library, driven by the desperate hope that research might somehow prove the Quibbler's claims were exaggerated or taken out of context. Instead, she was finding gaps. Not the normal gaps that occurred when books were borrowed or misfiled, but systematic absences that spoke of deliberate removal. The section on recent wizarding conflicts contained books with pages that had been carefully excised. The biographical entries for several prominent wizarding families simply stopped at certain dates, as if their histories had been deemed too sensitive to record. Most troubling of all, the records of Hogwarts correspondence with the Ministry, documents that should have been available for historical research, were sealed under what appeared to be very recent classification orders. "Someone doesn't want this information to be easily accessible," she murmured to herself, pulling another book from the shelf only to find that its most relevant chapters had been removed with surgical precision. "Finding everything you need, Miss Granger." Hermione spun around to find Professor Umbridge standing behind her, wearing that satisfied smile that made everyone's skin crawl. "I'm researching historical documentation practices," Hermione said carefully, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. "How academic of you." Umbridge's eyes swept over the pile of books Hermione had accumulated, noting the gaps and missing sections with obvious amusement. "I do hope you're not putting too much stock in sensationalist publications. Young minds can be so easily influenced by conspiracy theories and unfounded accusations." "I'm trying to verify claims through primary sources," Hermione replied, maintaining her composure despite the way Umbridge's presence made her want to hex something. It's what any good researcher would do. But what happens when the primary sources have been, shall we say, curated for accuracy and appropriateness? Umbridge's smile widened. The Ministry takes great care to ensure that only verified, uncontroversial information remains available to the public. We wouldn't want students forming incorrect impressions about their betters, would we? The implication hung in the air like smoke from a particularly noxious potion. Hermione felt something cold and angry settle in her chest as she realized exactly what Umbridge was telling her. You're saying the records have been deliberately altered. I'm saying that responsible authority figures sometimes need to make difficult decisions about what information serves the public good. Umbridge's voice carried that false sweetness that made every word sound like a threat. I do hope you'll remember that when you're writing up your research findings. After Umbridge glided away, Hermione stood alone among the violated books and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. If the written record could be manipulated so easily, if history itself could be edited to protect the powerful, then how many other truths had been quietly erased? She gathered her things with sudden urgency. Harry and Ron needed to know about this. Everyone needed to know about this. In the Ravenclaw common room, Neville Longbottom sat surrounded by his housemates in a silence that had nothing to do with their usual appreciation for intellectual discourse. The copy of the Quibbler lay open on the table between them, turned to the page that featured a photograph of his parents in their Auror uniforms, alongside a detailed account of how their torture had been a direct result of strategic decisions made by people who should have protected them. Luna sat beside him with her usual tranquil expression, but her presence felt different now, less dreamy and more substantial, as if revealing the truth had made her more real somehow. Did you know? Neville's voice was barely audible. When you wrote this, did you know what it would do to people? Luna considered the question with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. I knew it would hurt, she said finally. Truth often does, especially truth that's been hidden for a long time. But I also knew that lies hurt more in the end. They fester. My Gran never told me the details, Neville continued, his hands trembling as he traced the edges of the photograph. She said they were heroes who died fighting dark wizards. She never said they were sent to their deaths by the people they trusted. Perhaps she was protecting you, suggested Padma Patil, though her voice lacked conviction. Or perhaps, Luna said quietly, she was protecting Professor Dumbledore. The words fell into the common room like stones into a well, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembled students. It was one thing to read shocking allegations in a magazine. It was another to have someone state them as simple fact with the sort of calm certainty that made denial impossible. My parents are still alive, Neville said, and his voice broke on the words. They're alive, but they're gone, and apparently it was preventable. Apparently someone knew it was going to happen and decided it was acceptable. One floor below, in an office that had seen more difficult conversations than most locations in the castle, Professor McGonagall paced back and forth in front of Dumbledore's desk like a caged lioness. Her usually perfect composure had cracked entirely, revealing something raw and dangerous underneath. Explain it to me, Albus, she said without preamble. Explain how you could place an 11-year-old boy with people who locked him in a cupboard and forgot to feed him. Explain how that could possibly serve any greater good. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, with his hands folded, looking every one of his considerable years. The portraits of former headmasters watched from their frames with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, but none of them offered commentary. Lily's protection, he began. Don't! McGonagall's voice cut through the air like a blade. Don't you dare hide behind Lily's sacrifice. Her protection would have worked anywhere her blood family lived. You could have ensured Harry was placed with relatives who would love him, or at minimum, not abuse him. You chose not to. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him before McGonagall's eyes. I believed that some hardship would make him stronger, less likely to develop the sort of arrogance that had destroyed other young men with great power. He paused. I was wrong. You were wrong. McGonagall repeated the words as if testing their weight. Albus, you sentenced a child to years of neglect and abuse because you were worried he might become conceited. Do you understand how that sounds? It sounds, Dumbledore said quietly, like the decision of someone who forgot that good intentions are not sufficient justification for causing harm. Before McGonagall could respond, the office fireplace flared green, and Professor Snape stepped through, his black robes billowing with unusual agitation. "The first carriages are approaching the gates," he announced without preamble. "Augusta Longbottom's among them, and she's brought friends." McGonagall moved to the window and looked down toward the main entrance. Sure enough, a procession of elegant carriages was making its way up the long drive, their occupants clearly visible through spelled windows. She could make out Augusta's stern profile, along with several other faces she recognized as belonging to influential members of Wizarding Society. "How many?" Dumbledore asked. "At least 30, Snape replied. "Perhaps more. They're organizing themselves in the entrance courtyard, as if they're planning something formal." "A tribunal," McGonagall said, the word falling from her lips like a curse. "They're going to put you on trial, Albus." Dumbledore rose from his chair and moved to stand beside her at the window. Below, the carriages continued to arrive, disgorging passengers who carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of people accustomed to having their voices heard and their concerns addressed. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time." Outside the castle, Luna Lovegood stood at the astronomy tower's base, watching the arriving carriages with the same calm interest she might show for an unusually shaped cloud formation. Other students had gathered to gawk at the unprecedented sight, whispering among themselves about what it meant and what would happen next. Several of her classmates had approached her throughout the day, some to thank her for bringing hidden truths to light, and others to blame her for destroying their faith in the adults they had trusted. She had accepted both responses with equal serenity, understanding that truth was like medicine. Sometimes it cured, and sometimes it simply revealed how much sicker the patient had been than anyone realized. "Are you proud of yourself?" The question came from a sixth-year Hufflepuff whose family had connections to the ministry. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Luna turned her pale blue eyes on him, with that direct gaze that made most people deeply uncomfortable. "I've told the truth," she said simply. "What people do with it is their choice." "You've destroyed everything," he accused. "People trusted Dumbledore. He's the only one who can stop you-know-who." "If someone's only qualification for leadership is that other people trust them," Luna replied thoughtfully, "perhaps it's worth examining whether that trust was earned or simply assumed." As the sun began to set behind the arriving carriages, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed oddly appropriate for what felt like the end of an era, Luna remained where she was. She had started something that morning with a simple decision to publish the truth, and now the truth was taking on a life of its own. Tomorrow would bring consequences that no one could fully predict. But tonight she stood witness to the gathering storm and felt a deep sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she had done what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. The truth, she reflected, had a way of finding the light eventually. Sometimes it just needed someone willing to open the curtains. Inside the castle, students huddled in their common rooms and whispered about what would happen when morning came. Teachers walked the corridors with expressions of barely controlled anxiety, unsure of how to maintain order when the very foundations of their authority were being questioned. And in his office at the top of the tallest tower, Albus Dumbledore sat alone with his thoughts and the weight of decisions that had seemed so clear at the time, but which now felt impossibly complex. The reckoning he had spent years avoiding was finally at hand, and for perhaps the first time in his long life, he was genuinely uncertain about what would happen next. Outside his window, the last of the carriages settled into place, and their occupants began to organize themselves for what promised to be a very long night. Chapter 4. The First Arrival. The Great Hall had never been designed to accommodate the sort of tension that filled it during the lunch hour on what would later be remembered as the day everything changed. Students pushed food around their plates without eating, their attention divided between the usual concerns of teenage life and the unprecedented sight of formal carriages, visible through the tall windows. The conversations that did occur happened in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the morning's revelations more real than they already were. Neville Longbottom sat at the Gryffindor table, mechanically spooning soup into his mouth without tasting it, when the enormous doors of the Great Hall opened with a sound like thunder. Augusta Longbottom entered first, and she entered like a force of nature. She wore the formal robes of the ancient and most noble house of Longbottom, deep burgundy with silver trim that caught the light from the floating candles and seemed to amplify her already formidable presence. The family crest, a crossed sword and wand beneath a rampant lion, was prominently displayed on her breast, leaving no doubt about whose authority she represented. Her hat, a magnificent creation involving what appeared to be an entire vulture, added another 6 inches to her already imposing height. Behind her came a delegation that represented some of the most influential families in Wizarding Britain. Eleanor Bones walked with the rigid posture of someone who had learned to carry grief like armor, her black mourning robes a stark reminder of her family's losses. Ignatius Prewett, ancient and gnarled as an old oak tree, leaned heavily on a walking stick that had been carved from what looked like a single piece of dragon bone. Several other figures followed, their faces set with the sort of determination usually reserved for declarations of war. The Great Hall fell silent, with the abruptness of a silencing charm. Even the ghosts stopped their eternal wandering, hovering uncertainly near the walls, as if sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Augusta's eyes swept the hall with the precision of a military commander, surveying a battlefield, taking in the sea of upturned student faces before settling on the high table where the teachers sat, frozen with various expressions of alarm and apprehension. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Neville, and something that might have been affection softened her stern features before hardening again into implacable resolve. Then she began to walk. Her footsteps echoed off the stone floor with the measured cadence of someone who had never doubted their right to demand answers from anyone, regardless of their reputation or accomplishments. The delegation followed in her wake, their own footsteps creating a rhythm that sounded remarkably like a funeral march. As they approached the high table, Albus Dumbledore rose from his chair. For perhaps the first time in anyone's memory, the legendary wizard appeared genuinely uncertain. His usual easy confidence had been replaced by something that looked disturbingly like resignation, and his characteristic twinkle was entirely absent from his blue eyes. "Augusta," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "This is unexpected." "Is it, Albus?" Augusta's reply cut through the air like a blade. "After this morning's revelations, did you truly expect that the families you've manipulated and sacrificed would simply accept your explanations in private? Did you think we would be content to suffer in silence while you continued to play puppet master with other people's children?" The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Students exchanged glances, filled with a mixture of excitement and terror at witnessing such a direct challenge to the headmaster's authority. Dumbledore inclined his head slightly. "I believe there may be some misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" Eleanor Bones stepped forward, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "My brother Edgar and his wife were led into an ambush. Your own strategic notes described their mission as likely to result in casualties, but necessary to maintain Severus Snape's cover. Where exactly is the misunderstanding in that, Dumbledore?" A collective gasp went up from the assembled students. Harry Potter, sitting at the Gryffindor table, felt his stomach clench as he watched the confrontation unfold. This was what Luna's article had started. Not just questions or doubts, but open warfare between the families who had suffered and the man they had trusted to protect their loved ones. Dumbledore's face went very still. The circumstances of the war... "Don't!" Augusta's voice cracked like a whip. "Do not hide behind the necessities of war when discussing the deliberate sacrifice of good people for your strategic games. My son and daughter-in-law trusted you. They followed your orders. They believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves." She took another step closer, and despite the significant height difference, somehow managed to look down at Dumbledore through sheer force of righteous indignation. Instead, they were used as bait, human bait, to draw out information and maintain the cover of your precious spy. And when the Lestranges had finished with them, when their minds were shattered beyond repair, you moved on to your next strategy, as if Frank and Alice were simply pieces swept from a chessboard. Neville made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. His face had gone white, and his hands were shaking so badly that Ron Weasley, sitting beside him, reached out to steady him. "Gran," Neville whispered, though his voice carried in the absolute silence of the hall. Augusta turned toward her grandson, and for a moment her expression softened with infinite tenderness. "I'm sorry, dear one. I know this is difficult to hear. But some truths are too important to hide, even from those we love." She faced Dumbledore again, and her voice when she continued was like winter wind off the moors, cold, unforgiving, and relentless. "You knew Frank and Alice were walking into a trap. Your intelligence was precise enough to predict the outcome with remarkable accuracy. Yet you sent them anyway, because their sacrifice served your greater strategy. Tell me, Albus, what greater good was worth the destruction of two of the finest auras of their generation? What victory was worth leaving their son an orphan in all but name?" Dumbledore opened his mouth to respond, but Ignatius Prewett stepped forward before he could speak. "And what about my grandnephews?" the old man demanded, his voice cracked with age but strong with fury. "Fabian and Gideon were barely out of Hogwarts when you sent them on that suicide mission. Brilliant boys, both of them. They trusted you completely." He raised his walking stick and pointed it at Dumbledore like an accusation. "You knew they wouldn't survive. Your own battle plans stated that their mission was designed to appear desperate enough to draw significant enemy forces away from primary objectives. You used them as a distraction, Dumbledore. My boys died buying you time to evacuate civilians from targets you deemed more important than their lives." A strangled sound came from the Gryffindor table, where Molly Weasley's children sat listening to details about their uncles' deaths that they had never heard before. Ginny Weasley's face was streaked with tears, and Fred and George looked as if they might be sick. "The war required difficult choices," Dumbledore began. "Your war," Augusta interrupted, her voice rising with each word. "Your strategies, your acceptable losses. But did you ask Frank and Alice if they were willing to die for your cause? Did you give Fabian and Gideon the opportunity to choose whether their lives were worth whatever tactical advantage their deaths provided?" The silence that followed was profound. Even the portraits of former headmasters had gone still in their frames, watching the unprecedented scene unfold with expressions of fascination and horror. "They volunteered," Dumbledore said quietly. "They volunteered based on incomplete information," Eleanor Bones shot back. "Edgar believed his mission was reconnaissance, not a suicide run to protect a Death Eater's position in Voldemort's inner circle. How many of your volunteers would have made the same choice if they'd known the truth?" Professor McGonagall had gone very pale. She stared at Dumbledore as if seeing him for the first time, her lips pressed together in a thin line that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "Albus," she said, her voice barely audible. "Is this true?" Before Dumbledore could answer, Professor Umbridge rose from her seat with that false smile that made everyone's teeth ache. "I think," she said, her voice carrying that nauseating sweetness, "that this is hardly the appropriate venue for such serious accusations. Perhaps these grievances would be better addressed through proper ministry channels, where qualified officials can—" Augusta turned toward Umbridge with the sort of look that could freeze fire. "Sit down," she said quietly. The two words carried such absolute authority that Umbridge actually took a step backward. Around the hall, students watched in fascination as the woman who had terrorized them for weeks suddenly looked very small and very uncertain. "I beg your pardon," Umbridge managed. "I said sit down." Augusta's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath that spoke of generations of pure blood authority and the absolute certainty that came with knowing your place in the world's hierarchy. "You are a ministry functionary, attempting to insert yourself into a matter involving ancient and most noble houses. You have neither the authority nor the breeding to address this assembly." Umbridge's face flushed red, then white. "The ministry has oversight of all magical education. The ministry," Augusta said with devastating calm, "exists at the sufferance of the families that established it. We created the ministry to serve our needs, not to rule over us. If you believe otherwise, perhaps you should review the founding documents more carefully." She stepped closer to Umbridge, and the height difference became comically pronounced, except that nothing about the situation felt remotely funny. "Now sit down, or I will have you removed from this hall. And trust me when I say that the ministry cannot protect you from the consequences of insulting representatives of the Sacred 28, while they are addressing grievances that date back centuries." Umbridge sat down with the abruptness of someone whose knees had suddenly given out. Around the hall, several Slytherin students who came from old pure-blood families were watching with expressions of awed respect for a display of social dominance they had never seen executed so thoroughly. Augusta turned back to Dumbledore, as if the interruption had never occurred. "You made choices, Albus. Choices that cost good people their lives, their sanity, their futures. And you made those choices without their informed consent, hiding behind noble rhetoric about the greater good while treating human beings as expendable resources." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the hall. "How many others, I wonder? How many families have suffered because you decided their sacrifice was necessary for your vision of victory?" Dumbledore looked older than his considerable years as he stood before the assembled families and their accusations. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him further with each word. "I have made many difficult decisions during my years as a leader in the fight against dark wizards. Some of those decisions required sacrifices that I would prefer not to have been necessary. But I believed then, as I believe now, that the alternative, allowing evil to triumph, would have been far worse." "For whom?" Ignatius Pruett demanded. "Worse for whom, Dumbledore? For the wizarding world in general? Or just worse for you personally, because it would have meant admitting that your strategies were flawed?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Around the hall, students began to shift uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, the systematic dismantling of everything they had been taught to believe about one of the most revered figures in their world. Harry Potter found himself thinking about the cupboard under the stairs, about years of hunger and neglect and casual cruelty that had been deemed necessary for his character development, about the burden of being the boy who lived, a weight that had been placed on his shoulders without his consent before he was old enough to walk, about all the choices that had been made for him by a man who claimed to know what was best for everyone. Neville Longbottom watched his grandmother face down the most powerful wizard in Britain and felt something shift inside his chest. For years he had been afraid of everything, of his professors, of disappointing his family, of living up to his parents' legacy. But watching Augusta Longbottom demand accountability from Albus Dumbledore, he began to understand that sometimes fear was less important than truth. As the confrontation continued and accusations flew like hexes across the Great Hall, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone present. The wizarding world they had known was ending. Whatever emerged from this reckoning would be different, perhaps better, certainly more honest. But it would never again be simple. The age of unquestioning trust in their betters was over, and Albus Dumbledore, the man who had saved them all, who had been their beacon of hope and wisdom for so many years, was standing at the center of the ruins of his own reputation, finally being called to account for the true cost of his victories. And in the profound silence that followed Augusta Longbottom's final question, everyone in the Great Hall understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. Revelations and Denials. The afternoon brought more carriages, and with them more grief. Amos Diggory entered the Great Hall with the careful, measured steps of a man who had learned that sudden movements could shatter what remained of his composure. His wife Molly walked beside him, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion that came from months of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Behind them came several other families whose children had participated in the Triwizard Tournament, parents who had trusted Hogwarts' reputation for safety, and Dumbledore's assurance that adequate precautions had been taken. The sight of the Diggorys caused a ripple of fresh tension through the hall. Cedric's death was still raw, still immediate in a way that the wartime losses of previous decades were not. Students who had known him, who had cheered for him during the tournament, shifted uncomfortably in their seats as his parents took their place among the other grieving families. Dumbledore had remained standing since Augusta Longbottom's confrontation, as if sitting down would constitute some form of surrender. Now he surveyed the growing assembly of accusers with an expression that combined weariness, regret, and something that might have been resignation. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall despite its quiet tone, "that we should address these concerns properly. All of them." He stepped down from the raised platform of the high table, moving closer to the families assembled before him. The gesture was clearly meant to reduce the physical hierarchy that separated them, but it also had the effect of making him appear smaller, more vulnerable. "You have come here seeking answers," he continued, "and you deserve them. Not deflections, not justifications, but honest answers about decisions that affected your families in ways that caused immeasurable pain." Amos Diggory's voice cut through the silence with the precision of a blade. "My son is dead because you allowed him to participate in a tournament that you knew had been compromised. You knew there were Death Eaters among the judges. You knew the tasks had been altered to target Harry Potter specifically." The accusation hung in the air like a curse. Around the hall, students who had witnessed the tournament's events began to piece together implications they had been too young or too shocked to consider at the time. "Yet you allowed Cedric to continue," Molly Diggory added, her voice breaking slightly. "You let him walk into the maze that night, knowing he was in danger, knowing that Harry Potter was the real target, and that anyone near him might become collateral damage." Harry Potter felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the truth of her words. Cedric had died because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, because Dumbledore's protection of Harry had made everyone around him a potential victim. "You are correct," Dumbledore said quietly. "I knew the tournament had been compromised, and I chose to allow it to continue rather than risk exposing our knowledge and losing the opportunity to capture the infiltrator." The simple admission sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. Students who had expected denials or explanations found themselves confronting something far more unsettling: complete honesty. "I believed that we could control the variables sufficiently to prevent casualties while still maintaining our tactical advantage. I was wrong. Cedric died because of my miscalculation, and I will carry that responsibility for the rest of my life." Responsibility? Amos repeated, his voice hollow. You'll carry responsibility. But Cedric will never come home. He'll never finish his education, never marry, never have children. Your responsibility doesn't restore what was taken from our family. Before Dumbledore could respond, the Great Hall's doors opened again, admitting another figure who commanded immediate attention, despite her relatively modest appearance. Andromeda Tonks entered with the measured pace of someone who had learned patience through suffering, but whose patience had finally reached its limits. She had changed from her traveling robes into formal dress robes that bore the Black family crest, a clear statement about whose interests she represented, despite her official disownment from the family. Dumbledore, she said, without preamble, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from pure blood breeding, combined with righteous fury. I think it's time we discussed what your greater good cost my family. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Everyone present knew the Black family's recent history, the decades of Sirius's wrongful imprisonment, the destruction of one of the Wizarding world's oldest lines, the ripple effects that had touched dozens of other families. Andromeda, Dumbledore acknowledged her with a slight nod. I wondered when you would come. Did you? Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Did you wonder, while Sirius rotted in Azkaban for 12 years, whether his family might eventually seek answers about how the supposed leader of the light could allow such an obvious miscarriage of justice to continue unchallenged? The silence that followed was profound. Even the ghosts had stopped their wandering, hovering motionlessly as they sensed the historic nature of what was unfolding. Sirius was captured by auras responding to Peter Pettigrew's apparent murder, Dumbledore said carefully. By the time I learned of his innocence, he was already imprisoned, and the evidence that could have exonerated him was complicated. Complicated, Andromeda repeated, her voice deadly quiet. My cousin spent 12 years among Dementors because the evidence was complicated. Tell me, exactly how complicated was it to verify that Sirius was an unregistered animagus? How difficult would it have been to test whether he could have killed 13 people with a single curse while in dog form? Around the hall, students began to murmur as they realized the implications of what she was suggesting. The case against Sirius Black had been built on the assumption that he had blown up a street full of people. But if he had been in animal form, or perhaps, Andromeda continued, her voice gaining strength, the complication was that questioning Sirius's conviction too closely might have led to questions about Peter Pettigrew's true loyalties. Questions that might have compromised your precious spy network before you were ready to reveal it. Dumbledore's face went very still. I did not sacrifice Sirius knowingly, but you didn't fight for him either. Her interruption was delivered with surgical precision. You didn't use your considerable influence to ensure he received a proper trial. You didn't investigate the circumstances of his capture. You simply allowed the convenient narrative to stand, because it served your purposes to have one of your most effective operatives presumed dead. That's not, isn't it? Andromeda stepped closer, and despite the height difference, somehow managed to seem to tower over him. Sirius Black, presumed Death Eater, could move freely among Voldemort's supporters without suspicion. Sirius Black, cleared of all charges and publicly vindicated, would have been useless to your intelligence operations. The accusation struck the hall like lightning. Students who had never considered the political complexities of wartime intelligence found themselves confronting the possibility that their beloved headmaster had allowed an innocent man to suffer for strategic convenience. 12 years, Andromeda said, her voice breaking slightly. 12 years of torture, of madness, of a brilliant man slowly losing pieces of himself to creatures that fed on despair. And for what? For the tactical advantage of having a presumed dead spy in your network? From his seat at the Gryffindor table, Harry Potter felt the walls of his understanding crumble further. Sirius had suffered not just because of a miscarriage of justice, but because Dumbledore had chosen not to prevent it. Every letter from his godfather that spoke of nightmares and struggles with sanity suddenly took on new weight. "Professor Dumbledore," a new voice interrupted the increasingly heated exchange. Professor Snape had risen from his seat at the high table, his black robes billowing as he approached the center of the hall. "Perhaps it's time to discuss the full scope of your recruitment strategies." Every eye in the hall turned toward the potions master. Snape's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his dark eyes that suggested he was about to reveal truths that had been buried for years. "Severus," Dumbledore said quietly, "this is not necessary." "Isn't it?" Snape's voice carried its usual sardonic edge, but underneath was something that might have been exhaustion. "These families deserve to know exactly how you've been manipulating people for decades. They deserve to understand that their losses were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern." He turned to address the assembled families directly, his presence commanding attention, despite his normally off-putting demeanor. "I have been Albus Dumbledore's spy for 15 years, he announced, his words falling into the silence like stones into a well. "Since the night Lily Evans Potter was murdered by the Dark Lord, I had served. Since the night I realized that my choices had led directly to the death of the only person I had ever truly cared about." The admission sent shocked whispers rippling through the hall. Students stared at their feared professor with new understanding, seeing him for the first time not as a cruel authority figure, but as a man destroyed by his own mistakes. "Dumbledore found me in my grief and offered me a choice," Snape continued, his voice steady but hollow. "I could serve him as penance for my role in Lily's death, or I could live with the knowledge that I had contributed to the murder of the woman I loved and done nothing to make amends." He paused, his dark eyes finding Harry Potter's green ones across the hall. It was not really a choice at all, was it? Grief and guilt make excellent levers for manipulation, and Albus Dumbledore is nothing if not skilled at finding the right leverage to move people in the directions he requires. Luna Lovegood, who had remained silent throughout the escalating confrontations, finally spoke from her seat at the Ravenclaw table. Her voice carried its usual dreamy quality, but her words were devastatingly precise. "Truth has a way of finding the light eventually," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Even truth that people have tried very hard to keep buried." Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood the weight that came with seeing clearly. "Yes, Miss Lovegood," he said quietly. "It does." He turned back to the assembled families, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his considerable years. "You have accused me of manipulation, of treating human lives as expendable resources in service of strategic objectives. You have suggested that I allowed good people to suffer and die because their sacrifices served my vision of the greater good." He paused, and the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "You are not wrong." The simple admission hit the hall like a physical blow. Students who had expected denials or justifications found themselves confronting something far more complex, a legendary figure acknowledging his failures while standing by the necessity of his choices. "I have made decisions that cost lives," Dumbledore continued. "I have allowed suffering to continue when intervention might have prevented it. I have asked people to sacrifice themselves and their loved ones for causes they only partially understood." He looked directly at Augusta Longbottom, then at the Diggories, then at Andromeda Tonks. "I did these things because I believed, I still believe, that the alternative would have been the triumph of evil on a scale that would have destroyed our entire world. But believing in the necessity of my choices does not make them less painful for those who bore their cost." Amos Diggory's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "Does that make it acceptable?" "No," Dumbledore replied without hesitation. "It does not make it acceptable. It simply makes it. What happened? The question now is not whether my choices were right or wrong, but what we do with the knowledge of their true cost. Around the hall, students struggled to process the complex moral landscape they were being forced to navigate. Harry Potter found himself torn between anger at the manipulation he had endured and a growing understanding of the impossible position Dumbledore had been in. Hermione Granger, ever the voice of reason, raised her hand tentatively. "Professor Dumbledore, if you knew these decisions would cause so much pain, why did you make them?" Dumbledore's smile, when it came, was sadder than tears. "Because, Miss Granger, leadership often requires choosing between terrible options and slightly less terrible ones. Because someone has to make decisions that no one should have to make. And because I believed, rightly or wrongly, that I was the person best equipped to bear that burden." He paused, looking around the hall at the sea of faces, some angry, some confused, some beginning to show the first signs of understanding. "I have been wrong about many things. I have caused immeasurable pain through my choices and my failures to act when action might have prevented suffering. But I have never, in all my years of leadership, made a decision based on personal gain or power. Everything I have done in service of protecting the people and world I love." "Even if that's true," Augusta Longbottom said, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "it doesn't restore what was taken from our families." "No," Dumbledore agreed quietly. "It doesn't. Nothing I say or do can undo the harm that has been done. But perhaps it's time to find a better way forward, one that honors both the sacrifices that have been made and the lives that still remain to be protected." As the afternoon wore on and more families shared their stories, a complex picture began to emerge, not of a villain who had callously manipulated innocent people, but of a man who had been forced to make impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and who had sometimes chosen wrongly. It was not a comfortable truth. It did not provide easy answers or clear villains to blame. But as Luna Lovegood had predicted, it was truth nonetheless. And truth, however painful, was always preferable to the comfortable lies that had sustained them for so long. The reckoning was far from over, but at least now it was happening in the light. Chapter 6. Fractured Loyalties. By evening, Hogwarts had become a castle divided against itself. The divisions didn't follow the neat lines that centuries of house rivalry had established. Instead, they cut through dormitories, classrooms, and friendships with the surgical precision of truth that could no longer be ignored. Students who had spent years defining themselves by their house colors now found themselves aligned with classmates they had barely spoken to, while being opposed by housemates they had considered friends. In the Gryffindor common room, what should have been a place of warmth and camaraderie had become something closer to a battlefield. Dean Thomas sat near the fire, arguing passionately with Seamus Finnegan about whether Dumbledore's wartime decisions constituted necessary leadership or criminal negligence. "He saved the wizarding world," Seamus insisted, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. "Without Dumbledore, you know who would have won years ago. Sometimes leaders have to make hard choices." "Hard choices?" Dean's voice cracked with disbelief. "Seamus, he let Harry live with people who locked him in a cupboard. He sent people to their deaths knowing they wouldn't survive. Those aren't hard choices. Those are calculated sacrifices of innocent people." Nearby, Parvati Patil nodded emphatically. "Dean's right. My family fought in the last war too, and we always wondered why some missions seemed designed to fail. Now we know." "You don't understand," Lavender Brown interjected, her usual airheaded demeanor replaced by something fierce and protective. "My grandmother lived through Grindelwald's rise. She told me stories about what happens when dark wizards aren't stopped quickly enough. Maybe Dumbledore made mistakes, but at least he was fighting for the right side." The argument might have escalated further if Harry Potter hadn't entered the common room at that moment, his presence immediately commanding attention and creating an uncomfortable silence. Everyone present knew that he was at the center of everything that had unfolded that day, the primary victim of many of Dumbledore's controversial decisions, and the person whose own suffering had been deemed acceptable collateral damage. "Don't stop on my account," Harry said quietly, settling into an armchair near the fire. "I'd like to hear what everyone thinks." The silence stretched until it became painful. Finally, Neville Longbottom, who had been sitting quietly in a corner since returning from the Great Hall, spoke up. "I keep thinking about my parents," he said, his voice barely audible. "About how they trusted Professor Dumbledore completely. They believed they were fighting for something noble, something that would make the wizarding world safer for their son." He looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. Instead, they were sent into a trap that Professor Dumbledore knew existed. They were tortured into insanity to protect his spy network. And I've spent my entire life believing they were heroes who died fighting evil. "They were heroes," Hermione said firmly from the entrance to the common room, her arms full of books. "Neville, what happened to your parents was horrible, and maybe it could have been prevented. But that doesn't diminish their courage or their sacrifice, doesn't it?" Harry's question was quiet, but sharp. If they were deliberately sent into danger without their knowledge or consent, what exactly were they sacrificing for? Dumbledore's strategic objectives? His vision of the greater good? Or were they just expendable assets in a war game? The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Around the common room, students shifted uncomfortably as they grappled with implications they had never been forced to consider. Meanwhile, in the Slytherin common room, a very different conversation was taking place. Draco Malfoy sat surrounded by his usual followers, but his expression was thoughtful rather than smug. "I have to admit," he said slowly, "I never expected to find myself defending Dumbledore." Pansy Parkinson stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "Defending him? Draco, your father—" "My father is in Azkaban because he chose to follow a madman," Draco interrupted, his voice carrying an unusual weight. "And maybe one of the reasons he made that choice was because he could see what the so-called light side was really like. Maybe he saw how Dumbledore treated people as chess pieces and decided that at least the Dark Lord was honest about his ruthlessness." Blaise Zabini leaned forward, intrigued. "You think Dumbledore's methods justified joining you-know-who?" "No," Draco said firmly. "I think both sides were fighting a war where ordinary people got crushed between them. But at least Dumbledore was fighting for something other than power. At least he was trying to protect people, even if his methods were questionable." Theodore Nott, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "My father told me once that war makes monsters of everyone eventually. Maybe the only difference is what they're willing to become monsters for." The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Crabbe and Goyle, who had spent the evening eavesdropping on conversations throughout the castle. "You should hear what the Ravenclaws are saying," Goyle reported with unusual animation. "Half of them think Lovegood is a hero for exposing the truth, and the other half think she's destroyed everything good about the wizarding world." "And the Hufflepuffs?" Pansy asked. "They're the worst," Crabbe said, with something approaching admiration. "They're actually organizing. Hannah Abbott and Susan Bones are planning some kind of formal response to demand changes in how Hogwarts is run." In the staff room, the teachers were having their own crisis of faith. Professor McGonagall sat at the head of the long table, her usually perfect composure cracked beyond repair. "I was there," she said, her voice hollow. "When we left Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep, I was there. I told Albus they were horrible people, and he said it was necessary. I trusted him." Professor Flitwick, whose diminutive stature often made people forget his considerable intelligence and experience, spoke quietly. "We all trusted him, Minerva. The question is whether that trust was misplaced or simply incomplete. Incomplete? Professor Sprout's voice carried a sharpness unusual for the normally gentle Hufflepuff head. Pomona, children were harmed. Students under our care suffered because we didn't ask enough questions or demand enough answers. And how many more children would have suffered if we had lost the war? Professor Vector asked, from her seat near the window. I'm not defending what happened to Mr. Potter or the others, but we can't pretend that the alternative to Dumbledore's leadership would have been pleasant. Professor Umbridge, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally cleared her throat with that distinctive little cough that made everyone's skin crawl. Perhaps, she said with false sweetness, this unfortunate situation demonstrates why the Ministry's oversight of Hogwarts has become so necessary. Clearly, giving any individual, no matter how celebrated, unchecked authority over our children's welfare was a mistake from the beginning. McGonagall's eyes flashed dangerously. Dolores, if you think the Ministry would have handled these situations better, I invite you to review their treatment of Mr. Black's case. 12 years without a trial doesn't suggest an institution I'd trust with children's safety. The Ministry has since implemented reforms. The Ministry, McGonagall said with cutting precision, has implemented reforms only when forced to do so by public pressure, rather like this conversation, actually. Meanwhile, in a corridor near the Astronomy Tower, Harry Potter had finally tracked down Luna Lovegood. She was sitting on a stone bench, gazing out at the grounds where the carriages of the visiting families were still visible in the moonlight. "Luna," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." She turned toward him with that direct, unsettling gaze that made most people profoundly uncomfortable. Harry had grown somewhat accustomed to it over the past month, but tonight it seemed to look straight through him. "I wondered when you'd find me," she said mildly. "I suppose you're angry." "I don't know what I am," Harry admitted, settling onto the bench beside her. "Angry, yes. But also relieved, and guilty for feeling relieved, and confused about everything I thought I knew." Luna nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Truth often has that effect. It's why most people prefer comfortable lies. "Do you ever regret it?" Harry asked. "Publishing the article, I mean? Starting all this?" Luna was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "Do you regret learning about your childhood?" she asked finally. "About how you were placed with the Dursleys and why? About the decisions that were made for you without your knowledge or consent?" Harry thought about the cupboard under the stairs, about years of hunger and casual cruelty that he had simply accepted as normal, about the weight of being the boy who lived, a burden he had never chosen but had always carried. "No," he said quietly. "I don't regret learning the truth, but I'm not sure I'm grateful for it either." "Truth isn't about gratitude," Luna said, her voice carrying that dreamy quality that somehow made her words more, rather than less, profound. "Truth simply is. What we do with it, that's where choice comes in." Across the castle, in the Gryffindor dormitory, Fred and George Weasley lay in their beds, staring at the ceiling and having the first serious conversation they'd shared in years. "Do you remember Uncle Fabian and Uncle Gideon?" Fred asked quietly. "Barely," George replied. "I was so young when they died. But Mum always talked about them like they were the bravest wizards who ever lived." "What if they weren't brave?" Fred's voice was barely audible. "What if they were just used? What if Dumbledore sent them to die because their deaths would serve some strategic purpose?" George was quiet for a long moment. "Does it matter? They're still dead either way." "It matters to me," Fred said. "It matters because if Dumbledore could treat them as expendable, what does that say about how he sees the rest of us? What does it say about the choices he might make about our futures?" In the Ravenclaw dormitory, similar conversations were taking place. Padma Patil confronted Luna directly about the consequences of her article. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Padma demanded. People trusted Dumbledore. He was the one thing that made most of us feel safe in this world. Safety built on lies isn't really safety, Luna replied calmly. It's just the illusion of safety, and illusions break eventually. But now what? Cho Chang interjected. If we can't trust Dumbledore, who can we trust? If the leader of the light is capable of treating people as expendable resources, what does that say about the entire war effort? Luna turned her pale blue eyes on both of them, and for a moment her usual dreamy expression was replaced by something sharper and more focused. Maybe, she said quietly, the problem isn't finding someone to trust. Maybe the problem is believing that anyone should have the power to make life and death decisions for other people without their knowledge or consent. As midnight approached, and the castle gradually settled into an uneasy quiet, the conversations continued in whispers. In dormitories and common rooms, in corridors and alcoves, students grappled with questions that had no easy answers. Some concluded that Dumbledore's methods, however harsh, had been necessary to prevent greater evils. Others decided that no cause, however noble, justified the deliberate sacrifice of innocent people. Many found themselves somewhere in between, understanding the impossible nature of the choices that had been made while still feeling betrayed by the deception that had surrounded them. But perhaps the most unsettling realization was that there were no clear villains in this story. No obvious monsters to blame or heroes to celebrate. Just flawed human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and the recognition that the comfortable certainties of childhood were gone forever. In his private chambers, Albus Dumbledore sat alone with a cup of tea that had long since grown cold, reading through letters that had arrived throughout the day. Some contained death threats from supporters of the families seeking justice. Others offered support from those who believed his methods had been necessary. All of them, he reflected, were missing the point. The question was not whether he had been right or wrong. The question was how to move forward in a way that honored both the sacrifices that had been made and the lives that still remained to be protected. It was, he thought, probably the most important question he had ever faced, and for perhaps the first time in his long life, he was genuinely uncertain about the answer. Outside his window, the grounds of Hogwarts lay quiet under the moonlight, but the peace was deceptive. The foundations of everything the wizarding world had believed about leadership, sacrifice, and the greater good had been shaken, and no one yet knew what would emerge from the rubble. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Chapter 7. The Ministry arrives. Dawn broke over Hogwarts to reveal a sight that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The grounds of the ancient castle crawling with ministry officials like ants on a disturbed hill. Black-robed aurors walked the perimeter in pairs, their wands at the ready, and their eyes scanning for threats that existed more in Cornelius Fudge's paranoid imagination than in reality. Department heads from every branch of magical government had arrived by portkey throughout the night, summoned by emergency orders that had awakened them from their beds with unprecedented urgency. At the center of it all, Minister Cornelius Fudge stood in the entrance courtyard, resplendent in his best formal robes, and wearing an expression of grim determination that fooled absolutely no one who knew him well. This was not a man preparing to conduct an impartial investigation. This was a politician who had been handed a gift-wrapped opportunity to eliminate his most persistent critic, and was trying very hard to look like he was reluctant to unwrap it. "Kingsley," he called to one of the aurors, "I want a complete security sweep of the castle. We cannot be too careful when dealing with allegations of this magnitude." Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose loyalty to the ministry was considerably more complex than his official position suggested, inclined his head professionally. "Of course, Minister. Though I should point out that Hogwarts has its own extensive protective enchantments, which clearly haven't prevented the systematic abuse of students and the manipulation of wizarding families," Fudge interrupted, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had finally found a lever long enough to move the world. No, Kingsley. I think it's time for fresh eyes to examine what has been happening within these walls. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Professor Umbridge was practically vibrating with excitement as she led Fudge through corridors toward what had once been a simple educator's office and was rapidly being transformed into something resembling a courtroom. House elves scurried back and forth under her direction, arranging chairs and tables in configurations that would maximize the psychological impact of the proceedings to come. "The families are already assembled in the Great Hall," she reported with barely concealed glee. "As you requested, I've documented every allegation and cross-referenced them with available ministry records. The pattern of irregularities in Dumbledore's conduct is quite extensive." Fudge nodded approvingly. "And Potter?" "Present and accounted for, though I should warn you that his testimony may be emotional. The boy has clearly been influenced by years of exposure to Dumbledore's manipulation." "Which will only serve to demonstrate the extent of the damage that has been done," Fudge replied smoothly. "Sometimes, Dolores, the victims of a crime provide the most compelling evidence against the perpetrator." They paused outside the Great Hall, where the sound of hundreds of conversations created a low rumble that spoke of tension barely held in check. Through the partially open doors, they could see students sitting alongside their families, ministry officials consulting thick files of documentation, and at the center of it all, Albus Dumbledore sitting alone at a table that had been positioned to face the assembled crowd. "Are you ready for this, Cornelius?" Umbridge asked, her voice containing a note of genuine concern beneath its usual false sweetness. "Once we begin this inquiry, there will be no going back. Whatever we discover about Dumbledore or anyone else will become part of the official record." Fudge straightened his bowler hat and checked his reflection in the polished surface of his silver badge of office. "Dolores, I have been waiting for this opportunity for years. Dumbledore has operated with impunity for far too long, making decisions that should have been subject to ministry oversight and accountability. Today, that ends." He pushed open the doors to the Great Hall with theatrical authority, and the assembled crowd fell silent, as if struck by a silencing charm. Every eye in the hall turned toward the minister, taking in his formal bearing and the phalanx of officials that followed in his wake. "Citizens of magical Britain," Fudge announced, his voice magically amplified to reach every corner of the hall. "We are gathered here today to investigate serious allegations regarding the conduct of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in his capacity as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The formal language created a hush that was both respectful and ominous. Students who had never witnessed the machinery of wizarding government in action found themselves holding their breath as history unfolded before their eyes. Dumbledore rose from his seat with the measured dignity that had characterized his entire career. But Harry Potter, watching from the Gryffindor section, noticed that his usual confident bearing seemed somehow diminished. The events of the past day had aged the legendary wizard in ways that mere years had not. "Minister Fudge," Dumbledore said quietly, "I welcome this investigation and the opportunity to address the concerns that have been raised about my conduct." "How good of you," Fudge replied with barely concealed sarcasm. "Though I should note that your cooperation isn't optional in this matter. The allegations against you are serious enough to warrant a full ministry inquiry with all the legal authority that such an inquiry entails." He gestured to the assembled officials behind him. "Department Head Bones from Magical Law Enforcement, Director Croker from the Department of Mysteries, Deputy Head Weatherby from the Department of International Magical Cooperation, all present to ensure that this investigation is conducted with appropriate thoroughness and transparency." Augusta Longbottom, who had remained at Hogwarts overnight and was now wearing formal robes that marked her as a representative of the Wizengamot, stood to address the minister directly. "Cornelius," she said, with the authority of someone who had known him when he was a junior clerk in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, "while I appreciate the ministry's attention to these matters, I want to make it clear that we are not here seeking political advantage. We are here seeking truth and accountability for actions that harmed our families. Of course, Augusta, Fudge replied smoothly. Which is why I believe it would be appropriate to begin with testimony from the primary victim of Professor Dumbledore's educational philosophy. He turned toward the section where Harry Potter sat with his fellow Gryffindors, and every eye in the hall followed his gaze. Harry felt his stomach drop as he realized what was being asked of him. Mr. Potter, Fudge continued, would you please come forward and tell this assembly about your experiences with your Muggle relatives, the Dursleys, and Professor Dumbledore's role in placing you in their care? The silence that followed was profound. Harry remained in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to process the impossible position he was being placed in. To testify honestly would mean publicly detailing years of abuse and neglect that he had spent most of his life trying to forget. To refuse or lie would mean protecting the man who had orchestrated that abuse while claiming to act in Harry's best interests. Mr. Potter, Fudge prompted, his voice carrying the particular tone that politicians used when they wanted to appear reasonable while applying pressure. The assembly is waiting for your testimony. It was Luna Lovegood who broke the paralysis. She rose from her seat at the Ravenclaw table and spoke in her usual dreamy voice, which somehow carried clearly across the silent hall. Perhaps, she said, Mr. Potter would prefer to have his father present for such personal testimony. The non sequitur caused confused murmurs throughout the hall until the meaning became clear. At the back of the great hall, a familiar figure had entered, with the quiet authority of someone who belonged wherever truth was being discussed. Xenophilius Lovegood walked down the central aisle between the house tables, his usually wild hair tamed into something resembling respectability, and his robes bearing the formal insignia of the Quibbler's editorial staff. Behind him came several other figures that Harry didn't immediately recognize until he realized they were reporters from other wizarding publications. Minister Fudge, Xenophilius said with a polite bow, I hope you don't mind the presence of the press at these proceedings. Given the public interest in these allegations and the ministry's commitment to transparency, I assumed you would welcome independent documentation of the investigation. Fudge's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a particular shade of purple that suggested high blood pressure and poorly controlled anger. This is an internal ministry investigation into matters that affect every wizarding family in Britain, Augusta Longbottom interrupted smoothly. I see no reason why the proceedings should be conducted in secret, particularly given that the alleged misconduct has already been reported in the press. Before Fudge could respond, Amelia Bones, the real Amelia Bones, not her deceased brother's relatives, stepped forward from the group of ministry officials. Her presence commanded immediate attention and respect from everyone present. With respect, Minister, she said carefully, if we are to conduct a proper investigation into these allegations, we need to ensure that all relevant evidence is presented and properly evaluated. That includes testimony from victims, documentation from multiple sources, and yes, public oversight to ensure the integrity of the process. Fudge looked as if he had swallowed something particularly unpleasant. The investigation he had envisioned as a simple political assassination was rapidly becoming something far more complex and potentially damaging to his own position. Very well, he said through gritted teeth. Let the record show that this inquiry is being conducted with full transparency and public accountability. He turned back toward Harry, but before he could renew his demand for testimony, Augusta Longbottom stood again. Minister, if I may suggest a different approach, she said, with the smooth diplomacy of someone who had spent decades navigating wizarding politics. Rather than asking a young man to relive traumatic experiences for our benefit, perhaps we should begin with the documentation that has already been compiled. She gestured toward Xenophilius, who stepped forward with a thick folder of papers. The Quibbler's investigation uncovered extensive correspondence between Hogwarts and the Ministry regarding Mr. Potter's placement and subsequent welfare. Perhaps we should start by examining what the officials responsible for child welfare actually knew. and when they knew it. The suggestion sent visible shock waves through the assembled ministry officials. Several of them began whispering urgently among themselves, and Fudge's expression suggested that he was rapidly realizing his political gambit might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. That documentation was classified. One of the department heads began. And illegally concealed from the public and from the families affected by the decisions made based on it, Eleanor Bones interrupted. My brother Edgar died following orders based on strategic assessments that were never subject to proper oversight. I want to know who else knew about these operations and what they did to prevent unnecessary casualties. The investigation that Fudge had intended as a surgical strike against Dumbledore was rapidly expanding to encompass the entire structure of Wizarding Government's wartime operations. Around the hall, students watched in fascination as they witnessed the political machinery of their world grinding inexorably toward a reckoning that no one had fully anticipated. Harry Potter remained in his seat, temporarily forgotten in the escalating political drama, and felt something like relief wash over him, as he realized that for once adults were going to be held accountable for their actions without requiring him to sacrifice his privacy or relive his trauma for their benefit. At the center of it all, Luna Lovegood sat with a small smile of satisfaction. Truth, she reflected, had a way of expanding beyond anyone's ability to control it once it was finally allowed into the light. The inquiry was just beginning, but already it was clear that by the time it ended, nothing in the wizarding world would ever be quite the same again. Outside the hall, owls circled overhead, carrying news of the unprecedented investigation to every corner of magical Britain. The reckoning that had begun with a simple magazine article was about to encompass the entire structure of power that had governed the wizarding world for decades. Change was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Chapter 8. Truth and Consequences. The moment when everything changed came not with drama or theatrical revelation, but with the quiet rustle of parchment as Amelia Bones opened the first file of what would later be called the Dumbledore documents. Before we proceed with testimony from individuals, she announced to the assembled hall, I believe it would be instructive to review some of the correspondence that has come to light regarding the decision-making processes that led to the tragedies we are investigating. She held up a letter bearing the official seal of Hogwarts, dated 15 years earlier. This is a memorandum from Albus Dumbledore to the then-Minister Harold Minsham, outlining what he termed acceptable casualty projections for various strategic operations during the First War against you-know-who. The silence in the Great Hall was profound. Even the portraits of former headmasters had gone still in their frames, as if recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the school's long history. The document, Amelia continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel, contains detailed assessments of which order members could be strategically sacrificed to maintain intelligence operations and protect what Dumbledore classified as irreplaceable assets. She looked directly at Augusta Longbottom before continuing. Frank and Alice Longbottom are specifically listed as expendable but valuable operatives whose capture could serve to reinforce Severus Snape's position within Voldemort's inner circle while providing opportunities for counterintelligence. Augusta's face went white, then red, then settled into an expression of such cold fury that several students instinctively leaned away from her. "You're telling me," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "that my son and daughter-in-law were deliberately used as bait to protect Severus Snape's cover?" Before Amelia could respond, Professor Snape himself rose from his seat at the high table. His normally pale complexion had gone ashen, and his hands were trembling slightly as he faced the assembled crowd. "Yes," he said simply. "They were." The admission hit the hall like a physical blow. Students who had spent years fearing and despising the potion's master found themselves seeing him in an entirely new light as he continued speaking in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. "I was present when the intelligence was delivered to Voldemort's inner circle Snape said, his dark eyes fixed on Augusta with an expression of infinite weariness. Intelligence that indicated Frank and Alice were investigating a location that would lead them directly into a trap. I could have warned them. I could have found a way to get word to them without compromising my position. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely audible. Dumbledore ordered me not to. He said their sacrifice would cement my standing with Voldemort and provide opportunities for future intelligence gathering that could save hundreds of lives. Neville Longbottom made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Around him, his fellow students stared in horror as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. They trusted me, Snape continued, his voice growing stronger as he seemed to find some source of strength in confession. Frank and Alice both trusted me. We had been in the Order together for 3 years. When they asked me about rumors of Death Eater activity in the area they were investigating, I lied to them. I told them I had heard nothing. He turned toward Dumbledore, who sat listening with an expression of profound sadness. And I have hated myself for it every day since. Minister Fudge, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the investigation expanded beyond his original intentions, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "This is all very tragic," he said with forced authority, "but we must remember that wartime decisions were made without proper oversight or accountability," Amelia Bones interrupted smoothly, "which brings us to the Ministry's role in these events." She opened another file, and Fudge's face went through several interesting color changes as he recognized some of the documents within it. "These are reports from the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, documenting multiple incidents of child abuse at the Dursley residence," Amelia announced. The first report was filed in 1985, when Harry Potter was 5 years old. A concerned neighbor reported observing a small child being locked outside in winter weather without adequate clothing. Harry Potter felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that his childhood suffering had been officially documented and ignored for years. The report was forwarded to the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes for follow-up, Amelia continued, where it was reviewed by then Junior Assistant Cornelius Fudge, who determined that intervention was not warranted because the child in question was adequately housed and fed. Every eye in the hall turned toward Fudge, whose face had gone from purple to a sickly green color. There were 17 such reports filed over the course of Mr. Potter's childhood, Amelia said, with devastating precision. All of them were reviewed by ministry officials. All of them were dismissed without investigation or intervention. Augusta Longbottom's voice cut through the shocked silence like a blade. "You knew. The ministry knew that Harry Potter was being abused, and you did nothing." "We followed proper procedures," Fudge began desperately. "You followed orders," Amelia corrected. "Orders that came directly from Albus Dumbledore, who used his influence to ensure that no official action was taken that might interfere with what he described as necessary character development for the boy." The accusation hung in the air like a curse. Around the hall, students struggled to process the revelation that Harry's suffering had been known to adults who had the power to stop it, but had chosen not to act. It was Harry himself who finally broke the silence. "It's true," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute stillness of the hall. "All of it." Every head turned toward him as he rose from his seat, his green eyes finding Dumbledore's across the crowded space. "I lived in a cupboard under the stairs until I was 11 years old, he continued, his voice steady but hollow. "My aunt and uncle told people I was at a school for incurably criminal boys because they were ashamed to acknowledge my existence. They fed their son until he was too fat to fit through doorways while measuring my meals to ensure I remained underweight." He paused, and the silence was so profound that his quiet words seemed to echo off the stone walls. "They locked me in my room for weeks at a time. They made me cook meals I wasn't allowed to eat and clean houses I wasn't allowed to rest in. When I showed signs of accidental magic, they locked me in my cupboard and told me I was a freak who would never amount to anything. His eyes never left Dumbledore's as he delivered the final blow. And apparently, this was all considered necessary for my character development. The emotional impact of Harry's confession was so profound that several students began crying openly. Even some of the ministry officials looked stricken as they confronted the human cost of the policies they had helped to implement. Dumbledore rose slowly from his chair, looking older than his considerable years. "Harry," he said quietly, "I am more sorry than you can possibly know. I convinced myself, that some hardship would prevent you from developing the sort of arrogance that destroys young men with great power. I was wrong. Terribly, unforgivably wrong." "Wrong about what?" Augusta Longbottom demanded. "Wrong about the necessity of child abuse as character development? Or wrong about your right to make that decision for another human being?" Before Dumbledore could answer, Eleanor Bones stood and addressed the assembly directly. "I want to read something," she announced, holding up a letter written in faded ink. "This is from my brother Edgar, sent to me 3 days before his death." He wrote, "Ellie, something doesn't feel right about this mission. The intelligence is too convenient, too perfectly timed. But Dumbledore says it's crucial for ending the war, so I suppose we must trust him. If anything happens to me, please know that I died believing I was fighting for something that mattered." Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "He died believing he was a hero, but he was actually just another expendable piece in Dumbledore's chess game." The revelation prompted Xenophilius Lovegood to stand and address the minister directly. "Mr. Fudge, I published these allegations because families like the Bones and the Longbottoms deserve to know the truth about how their loved ones died. But I'm beginning to wonder if the real story is even more complex than we realized." He opened his own file and withdrew a letter bearing ministry letterhead. "This is correspondence between your office and Dumbledore's, dated 6 months ago, discussing strategies for discrediting Harry Potter's claims about you-know-who's return. The letter specifically mentions using Mr. Potter's documented history of traumatic experiences to undermine his credibility." Fudge's face went completely white as he realized his own political maneuvering was being exposed. "You have been using Harry Potter's abuse you knew about and failed to prevent, as evidence that he is unstable and unreliable," Xenophilius continued with devastating calm. "You turned his suffering into a political weapon against him." The hall erupted in angry murmurs as students and families processed this final revelation. The investigation that had begun as an examination of Dumbledore's conduct had revealed a web of complicity and corruption that touched every level of wizarding government. Luna Lovegood, who had remained silent throughout the escalating revelations, finally stood to address the assembly. "I knew this would hurt people," she said, her dreamy voice somehow carrying clearly above the agitated conversations. "I knew that revealing these truths would cause pain and anger and confusion. But I also knew that lies hurt more in the end. They fester and spread and corrupt everything they touch." She looked directly at her father, then at the families who had suffered, then at the students who were struggling to process everything they had learned. "Truth doesn't make things better instantly," she continued. "Sometimes it makes things worse before they get better. But it's still preferable to living in a world built on comfortable lies that protect the powerful while sacrificing the innocent." Augusta Longbottom, whose fury had been building throughout the afternoon, finally exploded. "Preferable," she demanded. "Luna dear, my son and daughter-in-law are in St. Mungo's, with their minds destroyed, because adults decided their lives were acceptable sacrifices for the greater good. Harry Potter spent his childhood being tortured by people who should have protected him. How exactly is knowing these truths preferable to the ignorance that might have allowed us to sleep peacefully?" Luna met her gaze with that direct, unsettling stare that made most people profoundly uncomfortable. "Because," she said simply, "ignorance didn't actually protect anyone. It just made it easier for the same mistakes to be repeated. And they would have been repeated, Mrs. Longbottom, again and again, until someone finally had the courage to say that some costs are too high to pay, no matter what victories they might purchase. The wisdom in her words, coming from someone so young, created a silence that was both respectful and uncomfortable. Around the hall, adults who had convinced themselves that their compromises were necessary found themselves confronting the possibility that they had simply been easier than the alternative of admitting error. Dumbledore, who had listened to the escalating revelations with increasing weariness, finally stood to address the assembly one last time. "I have made choices that cost lives and destroyed futures," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his years. "I have convinced myself that these choices were necessary, that they served the greater good, that the alternatives would have been worse. Some of that may even be true, but truth and necessity do not absolve me of responsibility for the harm I have caused." He paused, looking around the hall at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by his decisions. "I cannot undo what has been done. I cannot restore what was taken from your families. But I can acknowledge that my choices were mine, that their consequences were real, and that no cause, however noble, justifies the deliberate sacrifice of innocents who trusted me to protect them." The confession was complete, honest, and devastating. It provided no comfort, no easy absolution, no simple path forward. It was simply the truth in all its complex and painful reality. As evening shadows began to lengthen outside the great windows, the assembled crowd sat in exhausted silence, processing revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world they lived in. The inquiry was over. The reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Price of Truth. The great hall emptied slowly as the inquiry concluded, families and officials departing in small clusters that spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, but the emotional aftermath of the revelations lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Augusta Longbottom stood near the high table, her formal robes still impeccable despite the emotional devastation of the afternoon. Around her, the other family representatives waited for her lead, understanding that as the most senior member of their impromptu coalition, her response would set the tone for everything that followed. "Albus," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of decades of accumulated grief and an afternoon of devastating revelations, "I want you to understand that I will never forgive what you did to my son and daughter-in-law, the deliberate nature of their sacrifice, the calculated way you used their trust against them. That is unforgivable." Dumbledore, who had remained standing throughout the exodus, inclined his head with grave dignity. "I understand, Augusta. I would not ask for forgiveness for the unforgivable. However," Augusta continued, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, "I also understand that you were fighting a war that none of us fully comprehended. A war where every choice led to suffering, where every strategy demanded sacrifice, where the alternative to your terrible decisions might have been even more terrible outcomes." She paused, looking directly into his eyes with the sort of penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I cannot forgive you, Albus, but I can acknowledge that you carried a burden that no person should have to bear, and that you carried it in service of saving our world. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't absolve you of the harm you caused." Eleanor Bones stepped forward, her own expression a complex mixture of grief and reluctant understanding. "My brother Edgar died, believing he was a hero. Today I learned he was a sacrifice. But I also learned that his death may have prevented hundreds of other deaths, that the intelligence gathered from his mission saved lives that will never know how close they came to being lost." She looked around at the remaining families, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "I don't know how to feel about that. I don't know if it makes his death more meaningful or less. But I know that hating Dumbledore won't bring Edgar back, and it won't prevent future wars from requiring similar impossible choices. Amos Diggory, who had listened to the afternoon's revelations with growing complexity of emotion, spoke quietly. My son died because of your miscalculations, Dumbledore. But he also died because he was brave enough to help another student, because he embodied the values that Hufflepuff taught him, because he was exactly the sort of young man we raised him to be. His voice broke slightly as he continued. I can hate you for the choices that led to his death, or I can honor the choice he made to be heroic when heroism was needed. Today I choose to honor Cedric. Tomorrow I may choose differently. The nuanced responses seemed to confuse Minister Fudge, who had clearly expected the family's anger to provide a simpler political narrative that he could exploit for his own advantage. Surely, he said with forced authority, the revelations of this inquiry demonstrate the need for immediate changes in leadership at Hogwarts. The systematic failures we've uncovered include extensive failures by the ministry itself, Amelia Bones interrupted smoothly. Failures that occurred under your direct supervision, Cornelius. If we're discussing leadership changes, perhaps we should start with institutions that ignored documented child abuse for political convenience. Fudge's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his political gambit had backfired spectacularly. Instead of providing ammunition to remove Dumbledore, the inquiry had exposed corruption throughout the wizarding government and undermined his own authority. The ministry's actions were, he began desperately, documented, witnessed, and now part of the public record, Xenophilius Lovegood said with quiet satisfaction. I imagine the wizarding press will have quite a lot to say about governmental officials who knew about child abuse and chose to ignore it for strategic reasons. As the political drama continued to unfold around them, Harry Potter slipped away from the Great Hall and made his way toward Dumbledore's office. The weight of the afternoon's revelations pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he knew that he needed to confront the man who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. He found Dumbledore sitting behind his desk, looking older than his considerable years. The headmaster's usual vibrant energy seemed dimmed, as if the act of confessing his failures had drained something essential from him. "Harry," Dumbledore said without looking up. "I wondered when you would come." "Did you?" Harry settled into the chair across from the desk, noting how different this conversation felt from all the others they had shared in this office. "Did you wonder what I would say to the man who orchestrated my childhood abuse because he thought it would build my character?" The words were delivered without anger or accusation, which somehow made them more devastating than any amount of shouting would have been. Dumbledore finally looked up, and Harry was shocked to see tears in the legendary wizard's eyes. "I have wondered that for years, Harry. Every time I saw you struggle with challenges that other children never had to face, every time I watched you carry burdens that should have been mine, I wondered what you would say when you learned the truth." "The truth," Harry repeated, testing the words. "Which truth, Professor? That my suffering was deemed necessary for the greater good? That my childhood was sacrificed to prevent me from becoming arrogant? Or that you've been manipulating every aspect of my life since before I could walk?" "All of it," Dumbledore said quietly. "All of those truths. And more. I convinced myself that I was protecting you, that the hardships you endured would make you stronger, that the isolation you experienced would prevent you from developing the sort of hubris that destroys young men with great power." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with hands that shook slightly. "I was wrong about so many things, Harry. But I was most wrong about my right to make those choices for you." Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing emotions that were more complex than simple anger or betrayal. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked finally. "It's not the abuse. It's not even the manipulation. It's that you were right about some of it. The Dursleys' treatment did make me stronger in some ways. Their rejection, did teach me to value genuine affection when I found it. Their cruelty did prevent me from taking my magical abilities for granted." Dumbledore's face crumpled, as if Harry had struck him. "Harry, please don't—" "Don't what?" "Don't acknowledge that your terrible strategy had some of the effects you intended." Harry's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm not grateful for what you did to me, Professor. But I'm also not going to pretend that it didn't shape me into who I am. The question is whether who I became was worth what I suffered to become it." Meanwhile, throughout the castle, students struggled to process what they had learned about the adults they had trusted to guide them. In the Gryffindor common room, conversations that had begun with outrage gradually evolved into something more nuanced and troubling. "I keep thinking about what Professor Dumbledore said about impossible choices," Hermione mused, curled up in an armchair near the fire. "If he really was facing the possibility of Voldemort taking over the entire wizarding world, how do you weigh that against individual suffering?" Ron, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since learning about his uncle's deaths, finally spoke up. "But who gave him the right to make that choice? Who decided that he got to choose which lives were expendable and which were worth protecting?" "Maybe," Neville said quietly from his corner. "No one gave him that right. Maybe he just took it, because no one else was willing to carry that burden." The observation created an uncomfortable silence as the students grappled with the possibility that leadership in wartime might require moral compromises that no ethical person should have to make. In other parts of the castle, similar conversations were taking place with varying degrees of sophistication and understanding. Teachers found themselves struggling to maintain educational focus while dealing with their own shaken faith in institutions and authorities they had trusted for decades. Professor McGonagall sat in her private quarters, staring at a letter of resignation that she had written and rewritten several times throughout the evening. Her loyalty to Dumbledore ran deep, but her conscience demanded acknowledgement that she had been complicit in systems that had harmed children under her care. Professor Sprout had cancelled her evening greenhouse duties, unable to focus on nurturing plants when her understanding of human nature felt so thoroughly uprooted. Even Professor Flitwick, usually ebullient and optimistic, moved through the corridors with an air of subdued thoughtfulness that spoke to the profound impact of the day's revelations. Luna Lovegood found herself in the unusual position of being simultaneously praised and blamed for triggering the crisis. Some students approached her with expressions of gratitude for her courage in revealing hidden truths. Others avoided her entirely, as if proximity to someone who had shattered comfortable illusions might somehow contaminate them with unwanted knowledge. "Do you regret it?" Ginny Weasley asked during a quiet moment in the corridor outside the Ravenclaw common room. "Starting all of this, I mean." Luna considered the question with her usual thoughtful attention. "Regret implies that I wish I had made a different choice. But I don't think any other choice would have led to better outcomes. The truth was going to emerge eventually. I just chose to let it happen in daylight instead of shadow. Even knowing how much pain it would cause?" "Especially knowing that," Luna replied. "Pain that comes from truth can heal. Pain that comes from lies just festers until it destroys everything it touches." Neville Longbottom spent the evening walking the corridors of Hogwarts, trying to reconcile his childhood understanding of his parents as heroes with his new knowledge of them as victims of deliberate manipulation. The cognitive dissonance was profound and painful, but somewhere in the process of grappling with it, he began to understand something important about the complexity of human experience. His parents had been heroes. They had also been victims. They had made brave choices and been betrayed by the man they trusted to protect them. All of these things were true simultaneously, and learning to hold contradictory truths in balance might be the most important lesson he ever learned. As midnight approached, and the castle gradually settled into an uneasy quiet, Professor Umbridge sat in her pink-decorated office, writing furious letters to ministry contacts, and slowly realizing that her position at Hogwarts had been fundamentally undermined by the afternoon's revelations. The political crisis she had hoped to exploit to consolidate her power had instead exposed the ministry's corruption and failures, making her association with governmental authority a liability rather than an asset. Change was coming to Hogwarts whether she wanted it or not, and for the first time since her appointment, Dolores Umbridge was genuinely uncertain about her ability to control the outcome. Throughout the castle, in dormitories and common rooms, in private chambers and quiet alcoves, the conversations continued in whispers and tears and slowly dawning understanding. The comfortable certainties of childhood were gone forever, replaced by the more complex and troubling wisdom that came from knowing that good people sometimes did terrible things for necessary reasons, and that the price of that necessity was always paid by someone. The truth had been told, and now everyone had to live with its consequences. For some, that meant forgiveness without absolution. For others, it meant understanding without acceptance. For all of them, it meant acknowledging that the world was more complicated, more morally ambiguous, and more requiring of individual judgment than they had ever realized. The reckoning was far from over, but at least now it was happening in the light. Chapter 10. Rebuilding Trust. 3 days after the inquiry, Hogwarts began to show tentative signs of returning to something resembling normal educational function, though the definition of normal had been fundamentally altered by the revelations of the previous week. Albus Dumbledore stood before the assembled school at breakfast, looking older, but somehow more substantial than he had in recent memory. The weight of confession seemed to have settled on him like a cloak, but rather than diminishing him, it appeared to have given him a gravity that his previous jovial confidence had lacked. "Students and staff," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the great hall without magical amplification. "The events of this week have demonstrated serious failures in how this institution has operated. Not just my failures, though those are considerable, but systemic failures that have allowed harm to occur when our primary mission should have been protection and education." He paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "Effective immediately, Hogwarts will implement new policies regarding student welfare, family communication, and institutional accountability. These are not cosmetic changes designed to appease critics, but fundamental reforms that acknowledge our responsibility to serve students and families rather than expecting their blind trust." Professor McGonagall rose from her seat at the high table, carrying a scroll that had clearly been prepared with considerable care. "The first reform concerns family communication. No longer will major decisions affecting a student's welfare be made without consulting their guardians, or, when appropriate, the students themselves. This includes housing arrangements, medical decisions, and any involvement in activities that present significant risk." A murmur went through the hall as students and remaining family members processed the implications. Harry Potter, sitting with his Gryffindor housemates, found himself thinking about all the decisions that had been made about his life without his knowledge or consent. "The second reform," McGonagall continued, "establishes a student welfare committee with representatives from all houses and year levels. This committee will have the authority to investigate concerns about student treatment and will report directly to the Board of Governors rather than through internal channels that have proven inadequate." Susan Bones, whose family's involvement in the previous week's revelations had given her unexpected prominence among her peers, raised her hand. "Professor McGonagall, who will serve on this committee?" "Students will elect their own representatives," McGonagall replied, with something approaching a smile. "Adults have demonstrated that we cannot be trusted to police ourselves when it comes to protecting children. Perhaps it's time for the children to have a formal voice in their own protection." The announcement created excited whispers throughout the hall. The idea of students having actual authority over their own welfare was unprecedented in Hogwarts' 1,000-year history. Professor Flitwick, who had spent the intervening days conducting his own review of house practices, stood to address the assembly. "The third reform concerns academic transparency. No longer will students be expected to accept assignments or participate in activities without understanding their purpose and potential consequences. If we ask you to face danger, you will know why. If we ask you to make sacrifices, you will know what they serve. Neville Longbottom, who had been quieter than usual since learning about his parents' fate, found his voice. "Professor, what about students who are already involved in dangerous activities? Students who might be targets?" The question was clearly directed at Harry, though Neville was too polite to name him directly. Dumbledore answered with careful consideration. "Mr. Longbottom, students who face unusual risks due to circumstances beyond their control will receive additional support and protection. But they will also receive honest information about those risks and meaningful choices about how to respond to them. No student will be asked to carry burdens in ignorance, regardless of how noble the cause might be." Meanwhile, in a smaller meeting taking place simultaneously in the Ministry's temporary offices at Hogwarts, Cornelius Fudge was discovering that political damage control was considerably more difficult than political opportunism. "Minister," Amelia Bones said, with professional courtesy that barely concealed her contempt, "the public response to last week's revelations has been significant. The Prophet alone has received over 3,000 letters demanding accountability for the Ministry's failures in child protection and war victim support." Fudge tugged at his bowler hat, a nervous gesture that had become more frequent as his political position deteriorated. "Surely we can manage the narrative." "The narrative," Amelia interrupted smoothly, "is that the Ministry knew about child abuse and did nothing because it was politically convenient. That narrative is supported by documented evidence and witness testimony. I don't believe it can be managed in the way you're suggesting." Professor Umbridge, who had been sitting quietly through the meeting while plotting her own survival strategy, cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps we should focus on the reforms that the Ministry is implementing to prevent future oversights." "What reforms?" Amelia asked with dangerous calm. The silence that followed was telling. In the rush to exploit the crisis for political advantage, no one had actually prepared constructive responses to the problems that had been exposed. "I see," Amelia continued. "Well then, perhaps it would be appropriate for the Ministry to withdraw most of its presence from Hogwarts, while the school implements its own reforms. We've clearly demonstrated that our oversight has been inadequate." Fudge's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his political intervention had resulted in the Ministry losing rather than gaining influence over Hogwarts. "Some Ministry presence is still necessary," he began desperately. "Professor Umbridge may remain as defense against the dark arts teacher," Amelia agreed with false generosity, "though I suspect her authority as High Inquisitor may need to be reconsidered in light of recent events." Back in the Great Hall, students had begun organizing their own discussions about what they had learned and how to process it constructively. Hermione Granger had proposed formal debate sessions in the evenings, and surprisingly, students from all houses had expressed interest in participating. "I think," Hannah Abbott said during one of these early discussions, "that the hardest part is learning that good people can do terrible things for good reasons, and that we still have to decide whether that makes the things less terrible or the people less good." The observation created a thoughtful silence among the assembled students. Terry Boot from Ravenclaw finally responded. "Maybe the answer is that it doesn't make either thing less true. Maybe Professor Dumbledore can be both someone who saved the wizarding world and someone who caused terrible harm to innocent people." "But how do we decide whether to trust him going forward?" asked Ernie Macmillan. "How do we decide whether to trust any adult if they're all capable of that kind of moral complexity?" Luna Lovegood, who had been listening from her usual position, slightly apart from the main group, offered her perspective with characteristic directness. "Perhaps trust isn't something you give or withhold entirely. Perhaps it's something you calibrate based on evidence and adjust based on experience. The philosophical sophistication of the discussion would have surprised any adult who overheard it, but trauma had a way of forcing maturity on young minds. Harry Potter found himself in the unusual position of being sought out for his perspective on moral leadership and institutional trust. Students who had previously avoided him because of his fame or his recent claims about Voldemort now approached him as someone who had unique experience with adult manipulation and betrayal. "How do you not hate him?" Cho Chang asked during one such conversation. "Professor Dumbledore, I mean, after everything you learned about your childhood." Harry considered the question while looking out over the grounds where families had gathered just days earlier to demand accountability. "I think," he said slowly, "that hate requires more energy than I want to spend on the past. I'm more interested in making sure it doesn't happen again." "But don't you feel betrayed?" "Of course I feel betrayed," Harry replied, "but I also feel relieved, I suppose. For years I thought there was something wrong with me, something that made my relatives treat me the way they did. Now I know it wasn't about me at all. It was about adults making decisions based on their own fears and strategies." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several owls carrying the latest edition of the Quibbler. Xenophilius Lovegood had published a follow-up article that students eagerly read aloud. "The Path Forward: Why Institutional Reform Matters More Than Individual Blame," Luna read from the front page. "My father argues that focusing on punishing Professor Dumbledore misses the point. The real issue is creating systems that prevent future abuse of power, regardless of who holds that power." The article outlined specific recommendations for reform in wizarding government, education, and family services. Rather than calling for Dumbledore's removal, it advocated for transparency requirements, oversight mechanisms, and accountability measures that would apply to any leader in any institution. "It's quite sensible, actually," Hermione admitted grudgingly. "Removing one person doesn't fix the systems that allowed the problems to occur in the first place." Meanwhile, some of the families who had confronted Dumbledore were working together to establish new support networks for war victims and their descendants. Augusta Longbottom had organized a meeting in Hogsmeade that brought together survivors and relatives from across the wizarding world. "We have learned," she announced to the assembled group, "that our pain was known to others but not shared by them, that our losses were documented but not honored, that our needs were acknowledged but not met." Eleanor Bones, who had become an unofficial spokesperson for the families, continued the thought. "But we have also learned that we are not alone in our experiences, that there are others who understand our losses because they have suffered similar ones. Perhaps it's time to create the support systems that should have existed all along." The meeting resulted in the formation of the Wizarding War Victims Alliance, an organization dedicated to providing support for families affected by conflict and advocating for policies that would prevent future abandonment of those who sacrificed for the common good. Back at Hogwarts, teachers were implementing new protocols for recognizing and addressing signs of student distress. Professor Sprout had established regular check-ins with students who showed signs of neglect or abuse. Professor Flitwick had created a confidential reporting system that allowed students to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Even Professor Snape, whose own role in the recent revelations had been profoundly damaging, made subtle changes to his teaching approach. While still demanding and exacting, he no longer used personal cruelty as a motivational tool, and students began to notice that his harshness came from high standards rather than sadistic pleasure. "It's odd," Neville observed during one of the student discussion sessions. "He's still terrifying, but it feels different, like he's trying to make us better rather than trying to make us suffer." The observation reflected a broader shift in the castle's atmosphere. While tensions remained high and trust was still fragile, there was a sense that honest dialogue was finally possible. Students felt more comfortable raising concerns with teachers, Teachers felt more comfortable questioning administrative decisions. Even the relationship between houses began to evolve, as students found common ground in their shared experience of institutional betrayal and reform. Luna Lovegood, who continued to face mixed reactions from her peers, maintained her characteristic serenity about the consequences of her actions. When a group of seventh-year Slytherins cornered her to express their anger about the disruption her article had caused, she listened patiently before responding. "I understand that you're angry," she said, with her usual dreamy directness. "Change is often uncomfortable, especially when it forces us to question things we thought we understood. But comfortable lies don't actually make anyone safer. They just make the danger harder to see until it's too late to address it constructively." One of the Slytherins, a boy whose family had connections to some of Dumbledore's wartime strategies, found himself reluctantly agreeing. I suppose we couldn't go back to not knowing these things, even if we wanted to." "Truth," Luna replied with a small smile, "has a way of being irreversible. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. You can only decide what to do with the knowledge." As October progressed, and the castle settled into new routines that incorporated the lessons of the inquiry, it became clear that, while the foundations of institutional trust had been shaken, they were being rebuilt on more honest and sustainable principles. The work of healing was far from complete, and some relationships would never fully recover from the revelations of the previous weeks. But for the first time in years, Hogwarts felt like a place where truth was valued more than comfort, where protection was prioritized over reputation, and where students were treated as people deserving of honesty rather than children requiring protection from uncomfortable realities. It was, Luna reflected, as she watched her fellow students engage in honest discussions about complex moral questions, exactly what she had hoped would happen when she first suggested that her father publish the truth. The truth had hurt, as she had known it would. But it had also healed, as she had believed it could, and that, she thought, was worth whatever personal cost she had paid to make it possible. Chapter 11. New Foundations. 2 weeks after the inquiry, Augusta Longbottom sat across from Albus Dumbledore in his office, the atmosphere between them civil, but fundamentally altered. The informal meeting had been arranged through Professor McGonagall, who had suggested that ongoing hostility served no one's interests and might actually harm the reforms they both claimed to support. "Albus," Augusta said, without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the complexities of wizarding politics, "I want to establish clear boundaries for any future relationship between the Longbottom family and Hogwarts." Dumbledore inclined his head respectfully. "I appreciate your directness, Augusta. What boundaries do you believe are necessary?" "First, no decisions affecting Neville's welfare will be made without consulting me directly. Not through intermediaries, not through official channels, not through assumed authority. If you believe circumstances require his involvement in dangerous activities, you will explain those circumstances to me in detail and receive explicit consent before proceeding." "Agreed," Dumbledore replied without hesitation, "though I would suggest that Neville himself should also be part of such conversations. He has demonstrated considerable maturity in recent weeks." Augusta's expression softened slightly at the acknowledgement of her grandson's growth. "Second, if you ever again develop intelligence that suggests members of my family are walking into danger, you will warn us. Whatever strategic advantage might be gained from their sacrifice is not worth more than their lives." "Also agreed," Dumbledore said quietly, "though I hope you understand that such situations are far more complex than they appear from the outside." "I understand," Augusta interrupted, "that war requires difficult choices. But I also understand that those choices should be made with the informed consent of the people who will bear their consequences. Frank and Alice deserved the opportunity to make their own decision about whether their lives were worth the intelligence that might be gathered from their capture." The conversation continued for another hour, establishing protocols for communication, oversight, and mutual accountability that would govern any future interactions between the Longbottom family and Hogwarts leadership. By the time it concluded, both parties had a clear understanding of expectations and limitations that neither had previously articulated. "I will never forgive what you did to my son and daughter-in-law," Augusta said as she prepared to leave. "But I can work with you to ensure it doesn't happen to others. That will have to be enough." "It is more than I had any right to expect," Dumbledore replied with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Augusta." Meanwhile, in the Gryffindor common room, Harry Potter sat with Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley, having a conversation that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. They were discussing the homework assignment Professor McGonagall had given them for Transfiguration, an essay on the ethical implications of magical transformation as applied to human subjects. "I keep thinking about what Luna said about not trusting anyone completely," Hermione mused, quill poised over her parchment. "It's not that we should become cynical or suspicious of everyone, but that we should expect evidence and explanations rather than accepting authority blindly." Ron nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense, really. I mean, look how much trouble we could have avoided if we'd asked more questions instead of just assuming adults knew what they were doing." Harry looked up from his own essay, where he had been struggling to articulate complex thoughts about consent and magical experimentation. "It's strange, isn't it? I spent years thinking that questioning Dumbledore's decisions meant I was being disloyal or ungrateful. Now I realize that real loyalty means caring enough to ask the hard questions. And real friendship means accepting that your friends might disagree with you sometimes," Hermione added, glancing at both boys with a smile. "We don't have to think exactly the same way about everything to support each other." The observation reflected a broader maturity that had emerged among the student body in the wake of recent events. Conversations that had once been avoided for fear of conflict were now engaged with enthusiasm, as students discovered that disagreement could be productive rather than destructive when approached with genuine curiosity and respect. Luna Lovegood found herself at the center of many such conversations, though her role had evolved from that of isolated eccentric to something approaching philosophical guide. Students who had previously dismissed her as Loony Lovegood now sought her perspective on complex moral questions, recognizing that her apparent detachment from social conventions had actually given her unusual clarity about human behavior. "Luna," Susan Bones asked during one of the evening discussion groups that had become a regular feature of castle life, "how did you know that publishing the article would lead to positive changes rather than just destroying everything?" Luna considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I hoped, based on my observation, that people generally want to do the right thing when they understand what the right thing actually is. But I couldn't be certain." "Weren't you afraid of the consequences?" pressed Ernie Macmillan, "of what might happen to you personally, or to your relationship with your father, or to the people who would be hurt by the revelations?" "Of course I was afraid," Luna replied with her usual directness. "Fear is often a sign that something important is at stake. But I was more afraid of what would happen if the truth continued to be hidden. Lies fester, and eventually they poison everything they touch." The philosophical sophistication of such discussions had not gone unnoticed by the teachers, who found themselves both impressed by their students' intellectual development and challenged by their increasingly probing questions about everything from curriculum content to institutional policies. Professor Flitwick had begun incorporating ethical considerations into his charms lessons, asking students to consider the potential misuses of spells before teaching them the proper applications. Professor Sprout discussed the responsibilities that came with knowledge of dangerous plants alongside their beneficial properties. Even Professor Snape, in his own indirect way, had begun emphasizing the importance of understanding why particular potion ingredients were necessary, rather than simply following recipes blindly. The change was perhaps most evident in Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, where Professor Umbridge found herself increasingly isolated as students demanded practical instruction and meaningful discussions about real threats rather than the ministry-approved theoretical framework she had been mandated to teach. "Professor Umbridge," Hermione had said during a particularly contentious lesson, "the textbook says that dark creatures can be controlled through proper ministry regulations, but the recent inquiry showed that ministry oversight has been inadequate in many areas. Shouldn't we learn practical defensive techniques rather than relying on institutional protection that might not be available?" The question, asked with perfect politeness but unmistakable skepticism about ministry competence, had been followed by supportive murmurs from students across all houses. Umbridge's authority, already undermined by the exposure of ministry corruption, continued to erode as students demonstrated their newfound confidence in questioning official narratives. Outside the castle, the families who had confronted Dumbledore were formalizing their oversight role through the establishment of the Hogwarts Family Advisory Council. Augusta Longbottom had been elected chairwoman, with Eleanor Bones serving as secretary, and Amos Diggory representing families of recent students. "Our purpose," Augusta announced during the council's first official meeting, "is not to micromanage the day-to-day operations of the school, but to ensure that the voices of families are heard in decisions that affect student welfare and institutional policy." The council's charter, published in both the Quibbler and the Daily Prophet, outlined specific responsibilities, including annual reviews of safety protocols, oversight of disciplinary policies, and advocacy for students who might otherwise lack effective representation. The ministry's response to these developments had been a mixture of grudging cooperation and bureaucratic resistance. Minister Fudge, politically weakened by the exposure of his own complicity in past failures, had been forced to implement reforms that he would never have considered voluntarily. "The new Child Protection Oversight Division," announced a carefully worded ministry press release, "will ensure that all reports of potential abuse or neglect receive thorough investigation and appropriate follow-up. The division will operate independently of other ministry departments to prevent conflicts of interest." The establishment of this division, while modest in scope, represented a significant victory for families who had spent years watching their concerns dismissed by bureaucratic indifference. Neville Longbottom, meanwhile, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic personal transformation of anyone at Hogwarts. Inspired by his grandmother's example of speaking truth to power, he had begun asserting himself in ways that surprised both his peers and his teachers. "Professor Snape," he said during a potions lesson, raising his hand with unprecedented confidence, "I don't understand why the bezoar needs to be added at this specific temperature. Could you explain the chemical reaction that makes timing so critical?" The question, asked without his usual stammering nervousness, demonstrated both genuine intellectual curiosity and a willingness to engage with authority figures as equals rather than intimidating obstacles. Snape's response, while still characteristically sardonic, lacked the personal cruelty that had previously characterized his interactions with Neville. "An excellent question, Mr. Longbottom. Perhaps you could research the relevant chemical principles and present your findings to the class next week." The assignment would have terrified the old Neville, but the new version accepted it with something approaching enthusiasm. He had learned from his grandmother that facing difficult truths with courage was preferable to avoiding them out of fear. As October drew toward its close, Hogwarts had settled into new rhythms that incorporated the lessons of recent weeks without abandoning the essential mission of education. Students attended classes with renewed focus, but also with heightened expectations for meaningful instruction and honest communication from their teachers. Evening hours were often spent in the informal discussion groups that had emerged organically from the student body's desire to process complex moral questions. These gatherings, which included students from all houses and year levels, had become a distinctive feature of castle life. "It's remarkable," Professor McGonagall observed during a meeting of the teaching staff, "how much more engaged they are with their learning when they feel trusted with difficult concepts and complex truths." Perhaps, Dumbledore replied thoughtfully. "We have been underestimating their capacity for wisdom. It appears that treating them as thinking individuals, rather than empty vessels to be filled, has improved both their intellectual development and their moral reasoning." The comment reflected a broader shift in educational philosophy that was evident throughout the castle. Rather than protecting students from uncomfortable realities, teachers were increasingly involving them in meaningful discussions about ethical complexities and practical applications of their magical education. As November approached, bringing with it the traditional rhythms of academic life, Quidditch matches, holiday preparations, and the increasing pressure of upcoming examinations, the castle's atmosphere reflected a new equilibrium. Not a return to innocence, which was impossible after what had been learned, but a mature acceptance of complexity that made genuine growth possible. Students who had once defined themselves primarily by house membership now formed friendships and intellectual partnerships based on shared interests and complementary perspectives. Teachers who had once relied on institutional authority now earned respect through demonstrated competence and honest communication. The evening conversations continued, often extending well past official curfew times, but with tacit approval from faculty who recognized their educational value. In these discussions, students grappled with questions that had no simple answers, developing critical thinking skills that would serve them far beyond their Hogwarts years. "I think," Luna said during one such gathering, "that we're learning something that most adults never figure out. That uncertainty isn't a failure of understanding, but a recognition of complexity. The world is complicated, and simple answers are usually wrong answers." The observation, delivered with her characteristic directness, captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred at Hogwarts. Rather than seeking comfort in easy explanations or blind trust in authority, the school community had learned to embrace the challenging work of thinking independently while remaining open to wisdom from others. It was, as Augusta Longbottom had noted during her meeting with Dumbledore, not forgiveness, but something potentially more valuable. A foundation for moving forward that acknowledged past failures while building toward a more honest and sustainable future. The truth had indeed been painful, as Luna had predicted, but it had also been liberating in ways that none of them had fully anticipated, creating possibilities for growth and understanding that would have been impossible under the comfortable lies that had previously sustained them. As the castle settled into sleep, the conversations continuing in whispers until exhaustion finally claimed the last determined philosophers, Hogwarts had become something it had never been before. A place where truth was valued more than comfort, where questions were welcomed more than easy answers, and where the complicated work of growing up was supported by adults who had learned to trust young people with the complexity of the real world. Chapter 12. The New Normal. 3 weeks had passed since the inquiry that changed everything, and Hogwarts had settled into rhythms that were both familiar and fundamentally transformed. The castle still woke to the sound of students hurrying to breakfast, still echoed with the scratch of quills on parchment during lessons, still hummed with the quiet energy of young minds grappling with magical education. But underneath these eternal constants, something profound had shifted. Professor McGonagall stood at her classroom window, watching students cross the courtyard below with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The conversation she could observe, animated discussions that crossed house boundaries, gestures that indicated genuine listening rather than waiting to speak, occasional laughter that suggested comfort with complexity rather than demand for simple answers, reflected changes that went far deeper than policy reforms or administrative adjustments. "They're different," she said to Professor Flitwick, who had stopped by to discuss curriculum coordination. "Not just more mature, though they certainly are that. They're more present, more engaged, as if they finally trust that their education is meant to serve them, rather than shape them into predetermined forms. Flitwick nodded thoughtfully, his eyes also following the students below. I've noticed it in my classes as well. They ask better questions now. Not just how or what, but why and what if and who decides. It's rather wonderful, actually, though occasionally exhausting. The observation reflected a broader transformation in the educational atmosphere at Hogwarts. Students who had once accepted assignments and explanations without question now engaged with their coursework as active participants rather than passive recipients. The change had forced teachers to become better educators, more thoughtful about their methods, and more honest about the complexities of their subjects. In defense against the dark arts, Professor Umbridge found herself increasingly isolated as students demonstrated their newfound confidence in questioning authority. Her attempts to maintain ministry-approved theoretical instruction were met with polite but persistent requests for practical applications and real-world context that she was simply unable to provide. Professor Umbridge, Hannah Abbott had asked during the previous day's lesson, the textbook says that dark creatures can be managed through proper administrative procedures, but the recent discussions about ministry oversight suggest that administrative procedures aren't always reliable. Shouldn't we learn practical defensive techniques in case institutional protections fail? The question, supported by nods and murmurs of agreement from students across all houses, had highlighted the fundamental weakness in Umbridge's position. Her authority had rested on the assumption that students would accept ministry narratives without question, but the inquiry had demonstrated that even the most respected institutions could fail in their basic responsibilities. Her influence waning daily, Umbridge had begun spending more time writing reports to the ministry and less time attempting to control classroom discussions that she could no longer dominate. Meanwhile, Albus Dumbledore continued to serve as headmaster, but in a fundamentally different capacity than before. The weekly meetings with the Hogwarts Family Advisory Council had become a cornerstone of school governance, providing oversight and accountability that prevented the isolation and unchecked authority that had enabled past mistakes. The new Quidditch safety protocols, Augusta Longbottom announced during one such meeting, reviewing the agenda with her characteristic efficiency, appear to be working well. No serious injuries in 3 weeks, and the students report that the additional precautions haven't significantly impacted the quality of play. Eleanor Bones nodded approvingly. The revised disciplinary procedures are also showing positive results. Students seem more willing to report problems when they know there will be fair and transparent investigation rather than arbitrary punishment. Dumbledore participated in these discussions not as supreme authority whose judgment could not be questioned, but as senior administrator whose decisions were subject to review and whose explanations were expected to be comprehensive and honest. I believe, he said in response to a question about curriculum modifications, that the integration of ethical considerations into all subjects has improved both the quality of instruction and student engagement. When young people understand the moral implications of what they're learning, they invest more deeply in mastering it properly. Harry Potter had perhaps undergone the most complex transformation of anyone at Hogwarts. His relationship with Dumbledore had evolved from hero worship through betrayal to something more nuanced and ultimately more sustainable. Respect based on understanding rather than reverence based on mystique. I think, he said during one of their regular meetings, sessions that had replaced the secretive conversations of the past with scheduled discussions where Harry could ask questions and receive honest answers, that I'm finally learning to see you as a person rather than as either a perfect mentor or a manipulative schemer. Dumbledore's smile, when it came, carried the genuine warmth that had been absent during the weeks of crisis and revelation. That may be the greatest gift that has emerged from this difficult period, Harry. For both of us, actually. I am finding it far more comfortable to be seen accurately than to be either worshipped or reviled for incomplete understandings of my motivations. "Do you think we would have gotten here eventually without Luna's article?" Harry asked. "Would the truth have come out some other way?" Dumbledore considered the question seriously. "Perhaps. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, as Miss Lovegood has observed. But I suspect it would have taken much longer and caused considerably more damage if it had emerged during a crisis, rather than being deliberately revealed in a controlled manner." The conversation reflected a broader recognition throughout the castle that Luna Lovegood's decision to publish the truth had been not only brave, but strategically wise. By forcing the confrontation during a period of relative calm, she had created opportunities for healing and reform that might not have existed during wartime emergency. Luna herself had continued her work with the Quibbler, but with a shifted focus that reflected her evolved understanding of truth-telling's purposes and responsibilities. Rather than exposing hidden secrets, her recent articles had highlighted positive changes and constructive developments throughout the wizarding world. Her latest piece, The Hogwarts Transformation, How Honest Dialogue Improved Education, had been reprinted in several other publications and sparked discussions about educational reform far beyond the castle grounds. "I think," she told her father during one of their weekly editorial meetings, "that truth-telling is most powerful when it creates possibilities for positive change rather than simply destroying what exists. We've shown that uncomfortable realities can be faced and addressed constructively. Now we should help other people understand how to do the same thing." Xenophilius nodded approvingly. "You've learned something that took me years to understand, Luna. The purpose of journalism isn't to cause maximum disruption. It's to provide information that helps people make better decisions." Throughout the castle, the evening discussion groups had evolved from crisis processing sessions into ongoing philosophical forums where students from all houses gathered to explore complex questions about ethics, leadership, and responsibility. These gatherings had become so popular that teachers had begun attending as participants rather than supervisors, contributing their perspectives while learning from student insights. "I've been thinking about what Professor Snape said about grief and guilt being excellent levers for manipulation," Neville said during one such discussion, his voice carrying the confidence that had emerged from weeks of practicing honest communication. "It makes me wonder how many other emotions can be used that way, and how we can recognize when it's happening to us." The observation sparked a lengthy conversation about emotional manipulation, institutional pressure, and the importance of maintaining individual judgment even when surrounded by authority figures who claimed to know what was best. These discussions had become a defining feature of the new Hogwarts culture, a place where complex questions were welcomed rather than avoided, where disagreement was seen as a path to deeper understanding rather than a threat to be suppressed. Professor Snape, whose own revelations during the inquiry had forced him to confront years of guilt and manipulation, had found unexpected satisfaction in these student forums. His contributions were still characteristically sharp and challenging, but they came from a place of genuine engagement rather than defensive cruelty. "The ability to think critically about information and motivation," he said during one evening gathering, "is perhaps the most important skill you can develop, not just for defending against dark arts, but for navigating a world where well-meaning people can cause tremendous harm through poor judgment." The families that had confronted Dumbledore had also found constructive ways to channel their experiences into positive change. The Wizarding War Victims Alliance had expanded beyond Hogwarts to advocate for better support services throughout the magical community, working collaboratively with both educational institutions and government agencies to prevent future abandonment of those who sacrificed for the common good. "We learned," Augusta Longbottom explained during a public presentation of their first annual report, "that individual tragedy often reflects systemic failures. By working to address those systems, rather than simply seeking personal vindication, we can honor our losses while protecting others from similar experiences. The Alliance's success in securing funding for counseling services, family support programs, and oversight mechanisms had demonstrated that constructive engagement could achieve more lasting change than confrontation alone. As November approached, bringing with it the traditional rhythms of academic life, Hogwarts felt like a place where growth was not only possible but expected. Students who had once defined success as conformity to house expectations now pursued individual intellectual development while maintaining loyalty to their communities. Teachers who had once relied on traditional authority now earned respect through demonstrated expertise and honest communication. The castle's atmosphere reflected what Luna had described as hard-won wisdom, the understanding that loyalty and accountability could coexist, that respect could be based on evidence rather than assumption, that difficult truths could strengthen rather than destroy relationships when approached with courage and good faith. On a quiet evening in late October, Luna Lovegood sat by the lake, reading the latest edition of the Quibbler while watching the sun set behind the mountains. The magazine in her hands contained no explosive revelations or hidden secrets. Instead, it featured thoughtful articles about educational innovation, community building, and the constructive application of lessons learned from difficult experiences. She had achieved what she had hoped for when she first suggested that her father publish the truth about Dumbledore's decisions. Not the destruction of everything that existed, but the transformation of what existed into something more honest, more accountable, and ultimately more worthy of the trust that people placed in it. The confrontation had been painful, as she had known it would be, but it had also been necessary, as she had believed it was. And most importantly, it had led to growth rather than simply destruction, the creation of something better rather than the mere elimination of something flawed. Around her, the castle glowed with warm light from windows where students gathered to study, to discuss, to learn not just facts and techniques but wisdom and judgment. The voices that drifted across the grounds carried the energy of young minds engaged with complex questions, supported by adults who had learned to trust them with difficulty and complexity. It was, Luna reflected, as she watched a group of students from different houses walking together toward the castle, exactly what she had hoped would emerge from the rubble of comfortable lies. A world where truth was valued more than comfort, where questions were welcomed more than easy answers, where the complicated work of growing up was supported by institutions that had learned to be worthy of the trust placed in them. The truth had hurt, as she had known it would. But it had also healed, as she had believed it could. And in the end, that healing had proven strong enough to support the weight of a community, learning to live with honesty rather than illusion. As the stars emerged overhead and the last conversations gradually moved indoors, Luna closed her magazine and made her way back to the castle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to apply the lessons they had all learned about the price and value of truth. But tonight, she was content to know that she lived in a world where those challenges would be met with courage rather than avoidance, where those questions would be answered with honesty rather than convenient fiction, where those opportunities would be embraced rather than feared. The truth had set them free, just as she had always believed it could. And that, she thought as she entered the warmth and light of Hogwarts, was worth whatever pain had been required to achieve it.